It's strange what kinds of things you remember over the years. Some memories just linger for no reason, stuck like old gum under a school desk. And others, the ones that make your heart beat a little harder every time you think about them. Those are the ones that settle in deep in a way you never quite shake. This one has stayed with me for over a decade. It happened when I was about 16 or 17, just a junior in high school, sometime around early spring. The days were getting longer, but the evenings were still chilly. I remember that. Back then, I was doing volunteer hours to put on my college applications. I wasn't particularly involved in church, but my best friend at the time was, and she invited me to come help out during the evening services. The church was offering dinner and daycare for parents who wanted to attend service and stay afterward for a kind of community meal. We volunteered to watch the kids in the daycare area while the adults were upstairs. The daycare section was downstairs in the basement of the building. It wasn't a scary basement or anything like that, just a typical finished church basement with off-white walls, fluorescent lights, and the faint smell of carpet cleaner. The whole area was split into 2 rooms that were connected by a single door. One room had a kitchenette, a small table, and shelves full of snacks and juice boxes. That was the snack room. The other room was bigger, with soft carpet, foam mats, plastic bins full of toys, and a TV on a wheeled cart that probably hadn't worked since the 90s. That was the playroom. We had about 8 or 9 kids that evening, all between the ages of 3 and 6. They came in sleepy, full of after-dinner restlessness. Some were cranky, some already running wild. We gave them some crackers and juice, then let them color while we set up the rest of the snacks. Eventually, once they were full and restless again, we moved them into the playroom so they could run around. I stayed back in the snack room to clean up the mess. My friend went with the kids to supervise the playroom. I was moving slowly, not in a hurry, wiping crumbs from the table, rinsing out the cups, putting lids back on containers. That kind of work feels mindless. You're just moving through the steps. I remember humming to myself. One little girl, maybe 3 or 4, had refused to leave the snack room with the others. She was small, with light brown hair and short curls, and a pink shirt with a cat on it. I remember she had tiny white sneakers with purple laces. She wasn't talking much, just clinging to a stuffed lamb and watching me as I moved around. I didn't think much of it. Some kids just get attached. She seemed calm, so I gave her an extra cracker and let her stay while I cleaned up. She sat at the edge of the table, swinging her legs back and forth, chewing on the cracker and watching me. At first, I didn't pay much attention to her. I figured she was just shy or tired. But at some point, I heard her talking, just a low whisper, not loud enough to understand. Again, I didn't think anything of it. Kids talk to themselves all the time, or to imaginary friends or stuffed animals. I wiped the counter and moved on to cleaning the little sink in the kitchenette. I glanced at her a couple of times, and she was still sitting there, swinging her legs, eating slowly. Then I heard the sound change. Her soft murmuring stopped, replaced by an odd silence. It felt sudden. I turned around just in time to see her whole body stiffen, and then she burst into tears. Not the kind of whimpering you hear from kids who miss their mom. This was different. Her whole face crumpled, and the cry that came out of her felt deeper. Real panic. Her cracker fell from her lap, half-chewed crumbs spilling out of her mouth as she wailed. She reached both arms up toward me like she needed to be picked up right that second. I froze for a moment before rushing over and lifting her up. I held her while she sobbed into my shoulder. Her whole body was shaking. I rubbed her back and tried to calm her. I thought maybe she had bitten her tongue or swallowed wrong or choked a little. I tilted her head gently, checking her mouth and face. Her lips were trembling, but there was nothing visibly wrong. No blood, no swelling. I held her against me, and she gradually began to calm down enough to breathe. Then she said something. I couldn't make it out at first through the sniffling and hiccups, but eventually she repeated it. I still remember the words. She said there was a boy picking on her, but he wouldn't stop. I thought maybe one of the older boys in the group had come back in while I wasn't looking and said something mean to her. So I looked around the room. It was empty, completely empty. The only sound was the faint rustle of toys and kid noises coming from the playroom next door. I was about to walk her through the door to the others when she pointed. She didn't say anything else. She just lifted one arm, her little hand extending past my shoulder, pointing directly toward the corner of the snack room. An empty corner near the bookshelf, half covered by a small rocking chair no one had used that evening. Her hand trembled as she pointed. Her lip quivered, and then she started to cry again. I didn't ask questions. I didn't try to talk her down or figure it out. I just walked into the playroom and handed her off to my friend, then stood against the far wall while trying to calm myself down. I wasn't scared of ghosts. I didn't even believe in that stuff. But something about the way she reacted unsettled me. It felt different than normal kid stuff. It wasn't dramatic or attention-seeking. It was pure fear. After the shift was over and the parents came down to pick up their kids, I didn't say anything about what had happened. I didn't even tell my friend the full story until much later. I just said the little girl got scared and cried. But I kept thinking about it for days afterward. Something about it wouldn't let me go. I replayed the scene over and over in my head. Her pointing. That corner. The thing is, I went back to that church a few more times. Not often, just when they needed extra volunteers. Each time, I avoided the snack room when I could. When I did have to go in there, I felt it again, that cold feeling in the middle of my chest. The corner she pointed to never looked different. There was never anything there. But I started noticing little things. The kids didn't like being in that room. They always rushed through snack time. They would fidget, stare at the door to the playroom, or look around nervously. Once, I caught a little boy backing slowly out of the room without saying a word, as if he didn't want to turn his back on something. He never said why. Another time, a little girl told my friend she had to stay away from the chair. She was pointing to that same corner. My friend brushed it off, but it made my stomach tighten. I started to ask quiet questions when the staff wasn't around. I talked to another older teen volunteer, a guy who'd been helping out for years. He mentioned, casually, that some kids used to get scared during snack time and that one of the church elders had joked about the basement being haunted by past congregation members. I didn't laugh. It wasn't until much later, maybe a year or two after I'd stopped volunteering, that I found out something that stuck with me. A friend of mine had joined a youth group that met in that same basement. She mentioned how they weren't allowed to hang out in the snack room after hours, not because of ghosts or superstitions, but because it made one of the staff uncomfortable. That staff member, an older woman who'd worked at the church for decades, had apparently lost her grandson in a tragic accident many years earlier. A fall, they said. He was around 4 or 5. No one gave me the full details, and I didn't push. But the way it lined up with everything, the age, the reactions, the weird behavior from the kids, it felt like all the pieces slid into place. Not in a spooky, haunted way, but in a real, heavy human way. Maybe someone died in that building. Maybe that trauma echoed in ways that kids could pick up on, even if they didn't understand it. Kids are sensitive. They pick up on emotion, energy, tension, whatever you want to call it. I don't think that little girl saw a ghost that night. I think she sensed something deeply wrong in that room. Some kind of invisible pressure left behind by grief or fear or pain, soaked into the walls over time like smoke. I never went back after that. I finished my volunteer hours somewhere else. The experience changed how I felt about those kind of places. Not because I was scared of anything supernatural, but because I realized how heavy the weight of sadness can be in a space. How it lingers. How kids feel it when adults don't. That moment stayed with me through college, through early adulthood, through job changes and moves and birthdays, and all the slow creep of life. And every now and then, especially when I see a kid sitting quietly in the corner of a room, whispering to no one, I feel that same cold knot in my chest, and I think back to the girl in the pink shirt, her small hand pointing to nothing, and those trembling words that shook me more than anything I've seen before or since. It wasn't a ghost story. It was something heavier, something sadder, something real. My aunt passed away last week. The kind of woman who didn't speak unless she had something worth saying, but when she did speak, it stuck with you. She had raised me for a few years when things were rough at home, and even though we had grown apart in recent years, her death hit me harder than I expected. There's something sharp and uncomfortable about losing someone who shaped you. It was like losing a part of my own memory. The funeral was earlier that day. I'd been holding it together for most of it, shaking hands, hugging people I barely remembered from childhood, and nodding along when they told me how proud she was of me. But when I got back home, walked into my room, and sat down on the edge of my bed with the suit still on, that's when it hit. Grief can be quiet. It doesn't always come out in screaming or sobbing. Sometimes it's just the weight of the silence that gets to you. That was what I felt, something heavy in the air, like I couldn't take a full breath. I changed into a t-shirt and sweats, wiped my face off, and laid down with my back to the door, facing the wall. I wasn't trying to sleep exactly. I just didn't want to sit up anymore. My dog, Milo, hopped up onto the bed like he always did. He walked a slow circle before lying down at my back, the way he always did when I was feeling off. He's not a working dog or anything, just a mutt with a crooked tail and big eyes. But he has this way of knowing when I'm upset. He doesn't do much, he just stays close. That's enough. The room was quiet. The kind of quiet where you can hear your own breath, your own heartbeat. The kind of quiet where even the air feels still. I closed my eyes, not really expecting sleep, but I must have drifted because the next thing I knew Milo was growling. That sound cut through the air like a blade. Low, guttural, not loud, but tight and tense. Milo doesn't growl. I've had him for 6 years, and he's barked maybe 20 times. He doesn't even bark when the doorbell rings. He just gets up, stretches, and walks to the window. So when I heard him growl like that, it sent a cold pressure across my chest. At first I didn't move. I thought maybe he heard something outside, a cat or a car. But the growl didn't stop. It got louder, like he was warning something. I turned slowly and sat up. He was already sitting up, his eyes fixed on the door. His body was still, but his shoulders were tight, his ears up. That was when I looked at the door too. There was something there. A dark shape. Not a person exactly. Not a shadow either. Just a black shape. Right in front of the door, like it had just stepped into the room. I blinked, thinking maybe my vision was just blurry from all the crying earlier. Sometimes your eyes do weird things when they're tired or you've been crying too much. I rubbed my face, sat still for a few seconds, and the shape didn't move. I squinted. It still looked wrong, but I couldn't make out any features. Just a darker patch in an already dark room. My chest started to tighten, and I felt a cold sweat building at the back of my neck. Then it was gone, just like that. I blinked, and the space where it had been was empty. The hallway outside the door was still dark, but there was nothing there. Milo stopped growling. He didn't lie back down right away, but he looked at me like he was trying to make sense of what he saw too. I told myself it was just my eyes, just grief or tiredness, or the way the shadows bend when the hallway light seeps under the doorframe. I lay back down. Milo stayed sitting up for a few more minutes before he finally sighed, circled again, and lay back down beside me. I didn't sleep, but I kept my eyes closed. Maybe an hour passed, maybe less. The only way I can measure time in that moment is by how it felt, long, quiet, slow. Milo was breathing evenly beside me. I had almost started to relax when it happened again, the growling. But this time it started quicker, sharper. Milo went from asleep to standing at the foot of the bed in less than a second. And this time he was barking. Not loud, not frantic, but short, deep, deliberate barks. Warning barks. His eyes were on the door again. I sat up fast. My heart was pounding now, not just from fear, but from confusion. There was nothing I could see this time, but the hallway outside the door looked darker than usual. Not pitch black, just off. Dimmer, like something was absorbing the light. Then I heard it. A voice. Not a whisper. Not a hallucination. A voice, quiet but clear enough to understand. It said just 3 words. Goodbye, JR. It wasn't my aunt's voice. It wasn't anybody's voice I recognized. But it sounded real. Too real to dismiss. Not in my head. Not a creak in the floorboards or the wind in the walls. It was a voice just outside the room. And they said my name. I jumped out of bed and ran to the door. I pulled it open fast, stepped out into the hallway. Nothing. No one. The hallway was empty. The lights were off, just like I left them. The front door was still locked. The back door too. All the windows were shut. I stood there for a while, my heart racing, trying to tell myself it was a dream. I'd imagined it. That maybe I'd finally cracked a little under the pressure of the day. But then I walked back to my room and saw something that didn't make sense at all. The balloons. I had some balloons in the corner of my room left over from a small get-together a week ago. They were helium balloons, 3 or 4 of them tied together at the base, weighted down by a cheap little plastic anchor. When I went to bed, they were still tied up, floating lazily above the corner. But now one of them was drifting around the center of the room. Just one. It was circling slowly, like it was caught in a current of air I couldn't feel. Just turning and turning in the center of the room, the ribbon trailing behind it. The others were still tied together in the corner. I walked over and looked closer. There was no tear in the string, no loose knot. The rest of the balloons were still bound tightly. I picked up the one that had broken away. Its ribbon was clean, perfectly intact, like it had never been tied at all. I sat down on the bed, holding it, trying to figure it out. I pulled the other balloons over and checked them again. Still tied together. Still tight. The ends hadn't frayed or loosened. The one in my hand hadn't snapped. It was as if someone had untied it and let it go. And that made no sense. No one else was in the house. All the doors were locked from the inside. No windows were open. There was no draft. Nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I stayed in the living room with the lights on and Milo curled up beside me. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't want any more noise. I just sat there, holding that balloon in my hand, and waited for the morning light to come through the blinds. The next day, I tried to rationalize it all. Grief does strange things. It clouds your thoughts, warps your perceptions. I went online and searched for explanations. Hallucinations from emotional exhaustion. Auditory illusions caused by stress. Balloons behaving weirdly due to shifting air pressure. Static electricity making one balloon separate from the others. I tried to believe all of it, but I knew what I saw, what I heard. Over the next few days, I tried to go back to normal. I didn't mention it to anyone, not because I was scared they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't know how to explain it without sounding like I'd lost my mind. I kept the balloon, taped the string to the wall. It didn't move again, but Milo changed. He started sleeping in the hallway instead of in my room. And every night around the same time, he'd get up, walk to my bedroom door, and just stare at it for a while before lying back down. No growling, no barking, just watching. It's been months since that night. Nothing else like that has happened. No more voices, no more shadows, no more strange behavior from the balloons. I haven't untied the rest. They're still hanging in the corner, deflated now, wrinkled and dull. But that one balloon, the one that broke away, is still taped to the wall. I don't know what happened that night. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe my aunt came back to say goodbye. That's not what I think happened. I think something broke in me that night. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made me realize just how much I had been carrying without noticing. I think the mind has ways of coping, and sometimes it chooses strange ways to say goodbye, even if it's just a voice we needed to hear, even if it's just a balloon we imagined let go. I still don't believe in the supernatural, but I do believe that grief lives in the body, that it doesn't leave when the tears stop, that sometimes it needs to be let out, and it finds a way, even if it doesn't make sense. And maybe, just maybe, that night was my mind's way of letting go, even if it scared the hell out of me, even if I still check the door before I go to bed. A few years ago, I decided to take a walk around my old neighborhood. It wasn't planned. I was back in town visiting my parents for a few days, and after lunch one afternoon, I stepped outside, mostly to clear my head. I've been feeling off lately, stress from work, sleeping badly, going through some personal stuff that was messing with my focus. A walk sounded like something normal, something that might ground me a little. The neighborhood looked almost exactly the same as it had when I was a kid. That felt strange in a quiet, heavy way. Some houses had fresh paint or new cars in the driveways, but the shape of the streets, the lines of the trees, the wide concrete sidewalks, I remembered all of it. It was a quiet place, a tree-lined subdivision tucked a little too far from town, where lawns stayed cut and nothing ever really happened. Back then, I'd hated how boring it was. But now, walking through it as an adult, it felt calm in a way I hadn't felt in months. I turned down my old street. The sun was just starting to tilt a little lower in the sky, making the leaves glow that rich golden color. A few yards up, I saw a kid at the edge of a driveway. I couldn't tell exactly how old she was from that distance, but she was small, maybe 5, 6 years old. She was sitting on a little bike with training wheels, those plastic rainbow streamers hanging off the handlebars, her knees sticking out awkwardly to the sides as she sat there, not moving. She was at the edge of the concrete, not quite in the street, not quite up the driveway, just on a line. She was looking at me. I noticed it quickly, that fixed stare. From a few houses away, I could already feel her eyes locked on mine. Kids stare all the time. I figured maybe she was just curious. I was a stranger now, in a way. I didn't recognize her, and I didn't expect to. My childhood neighborhood had long since filled up with new families. I kept walking, but something about her posture gave me pause. She wasn't just staring. She was sitting totally still, her shoulders hunched up slightly, her hands gripping the handlebars in a tight way. And even from that far away, I could tell she was saying something. Her mouth was moving barely. Her lips were fluttering in that odd way kids do when they whisper to themselves during play. I thought maybe she was pretending something, talking to an imaginary friend, that sort of thing. But she wasn't smiling, and her eyes never left mine. I slowed a little as I got closer. I don't know why. Maybe it was just instinct. Maybe something about her stillness made me feel like I was interrupting something, even though that didn't make any sense. I looked around, almost unconsciously. There were no adults nearby, no one standing in the garage, no cars pulling into driveways. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind of stillness you only notice when you're walking alone with no music, no phone in your hand. There was the distant sound of a lawnmower a few blocks away, maybe a dog barking faintly. Otherwise, it was silent. As I got within maybe 10 or 15 feet of her, I could hear the whispering. That's when I realized she wasn't just talking to herself like a kid might. It was too repetitive. It wasn't nonsense or story-making. It was something rhythmic over and over. But even that close, I couldn't make out the actual words. Just a faint, scratchy sound of whispering, like a breeze rattling through teeth. She didn't stop when I approached. Didn't blink, didn't look away. I walked slowly past her, keeping to the sidewalk. I could feel my heartbeat pick up a little. It wasn't that anything was happening. Nothing actually happened. It was just the sheer oddness of it. That fixed stare, the whispering. It felt like she knew something I didn't. Then, just as I was passing in front of her driveway, she raised her right hand from the handlebars. Slowly, deliberately. Her arm moved smoothly, with no childish jerking or fumbling. She held her finger to her lips, as if telling me to be quiet. Her mouth was still moving, whispering something beneath that finger. That was it. I didn't stop walking. I didn't even look directly at her. I just kept my head forward and moved a little faster. Not running, but not strolling either. Something in my chest tightened. Not fear exactly. More like a rising discomfort. A pressure I didn't want to acknowledge. I walked faster. I didn't look back. I kept going around the block, but my pace never slowed. I took turns automatically, moving through streets I hadn't thought about in years, the layout coming back to me without effort. I saw the tennis courts I used to ride past on my bike, the old cul-de-sac where we set up lemonade stands. But none of it felt nostalgic anymore. It felt like I was being watched, even though I knew that didn't make sense. By the time I got back to my parents' house, my shirt was stuck to my back with sweat. I went inside without saying much, drank a glass of water, and sat in the living room trying not to think about how weird I felt. It wasn't a fear I could explain. It wasn't even about the girl, really. It was the way it had all felt too precise, too intentional. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the same room I'd slept in as a kid, staring at the ceiling in the dark. I kept thinking about her face, her posture, how calm she was, how unnatural that calm felt on a 5-year-old. The next morning, I asked my mom if anyone knew had moved into the Hendersons' old house, the one near where I'd seen the girl. She said yes, a young couple with 2 little kids. I asked if she knew them. She said not really. They mostly kept to themselves. I let it go after that. Told myself I was just out of sorts. Maybe I was. I didn't go for any more walks the rest of my visit. I left town 2 days later, went back to my apartment, and tried not to think about it. For a while I didn't, but the feeling stayed. That tight, crawling unease. It settled into me in a way that didn't make sense, not for something so minor. It stuck around. About 6 months after that visit, I was back in town again, this time for Thanksgiving. The first day I was there, I took the car and ran to the grocery store to help my mom with some last-minute shopping. On the way back, I took the long route home, past the house where I'd seen the girl. She wasn't there, but the driveway was empty. No toys, no bike. The yard looked too clean. I slowed the car slightly, just enough to glance at the house as I passed. The curtains were pulled tight across every window. It looked quiet, closed off. The next day, I brought it up again to my mom casually. I said I thought they had kids, the people who moved in. She gave a kind of half shrug. I think they do, she said, but I never see them. That's all she said. That was it. I didn't push it. I didn't say anything else. I try not to think about it the rest of the trip, but something shifted after that. It was small, and it happened over time, but I started avoiding certain places. That neighborhood, side streets near parks. When I saw kids on the sidewalk now, especially if they were alone, I found myself crossing the street. Even if they were just playing, riding scooters, or chalking up the sidewalk, I didn't want to be near them. Not in the way I used to. Something about that one moment with the girl had changed the shape of how I saw them. I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? It wasn't fear. Not really. It was something colder. A low-level suspicion. Like I'd brushed up against something I wasn't supposed to notice. Over time, the memory of her face started to fade, but the feeling didn't. The way she looked at me, without blinking. The finger to her lips. That whisper that never stopped, no matter how close I got. Eventually, I moved to a different city. A bigger one. Apartment buildings, crowded streets. The kind of place where people don't make eye contact on sidewalks. That helped in its way, but I never went back to that neighborhood again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it. If the girl was just playing a game. If she even lived there. If maybe I caught her at the tail end of some pretend world, and she just happened to include me in it by accident. That's the version I like best. That's the one I repeat to myself when I think about it too long. But deep down, I don't believe it. I don't think she was playing. I don't think it was a game at all. I think I walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. And whatever it was, whatever she was doing, it was meant to be silent. That whisper wasn't for me. It was for whatever she was telling to stay quiet. I was 6 years old, I think. It's hard to remember the exact year when you're that young, but I remember the way the house looked. The smell of it, too. Kind of old, but not in a bad way. Just lived in. The first house I ever lived in. It was a single-story home in a quiet neighborhood, with a driveway that sloped down slightly into a garage that always smelled like grass clippings and motor oil. We had this old screen door that creaked no matter how gently you opened it. I can still hear that sound in my head if I try. The living room was where we spent most of our time. It had these two couches that sat opposite each other. Not huge ones, but they were firm and simple and kind of itchy if you wore shorts. One was against the far wall, and the other faced it, backed up against the big front window that looked out to the street. That room was always dim, even during the day, because the front of the house had these tall trees with thick leaves that blocked most of the sunlight. The carpet was brown, maybe beige, somewhere in between, and old enough that the fibers were flat in the places where people walked most. That's where I remember lying sometimes, on my belly with a blanket, watching cartoons, feeling the ridges in the carpet under my chin. I don't know why we were sleeping in the living room that night. It wasn't something we normally did. I can't even remember what time of year it was, but I want to say it was cooler than normal. Not cold enough for the heat, just enough for long sleeves. My mom had made a little sleep space on one of the couches. I don't remember helping her or anything, just remember already being under the covers. I was lying on one couch, she was on the other. The TV was off. It must have been late, past my bedtime. The house was quiet the way it only gets at night, when even the refrigerator hum sounds like it's trying not to wake anyone. The hallway was on the far side of the living room, leading to the bedrooms and bathroom. It was always dark down there. The overhead light in the hallway had a pull chain that didn't work right, so most of the time we left it off. Even during the day, that hallway felt like a different part of the house. Cooler, darker, quieter. It had this long, thin rug that would wrinkle up no matter how many times you smoothed it out, and I always stepped around it, not over it. It was just one of those weird little things I did without thinking. I don't know what time it was when my mom woke up, but I felt her movement before I opened my eyes. She shifted on the couch, and I heard the blanket rustle. I opened my eyes a crack. The room was lit only by the porch light that filtered in through the curtains behind me, soft and orange. It gave the whole room this washed out kind of glow, just enough to see shapes. I remember the ceiling fan wasn't on. The blades were still. She didn't say anything, didn't move much. I felt her shift again, just a little, and she nudged my foot, just a gentle touch. I opened my eyes all the way then and looked at her. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking across the room, past me, toward the hallway. I followed her gaze. It was strange how calm everything felt, even then. At first, I didn't see anything, just the dark rectangle of the hallway entrance, blacker than the rest of the room. But then my eyes adjusted more, and I saw her. She was a girl, maybe my age, maybe older. It's hard to say. She had long black hair, perfectly straight, and she was wearing a light blue nightgown with long sleeves that came down her wrists. The fabric looked soft, like something made of cotton or flannel, and it hung almost at her ankles. She was barefoot. She wasn't in a hurry, just walking slowly down the hallway like she knew where she was going. Her arms were at her sides. Her head was down slightly, just enough that I couldn't quite see her face. But I could see the shape of her cheeks, the line of her nose. Her skin was pale, but not sickly, just soft and light. She walked down the hallway toward us without hesitation, passed into the living room without stopping, and continued past both of us. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to hear if she had made any noise. She didn't. No footsteps, no creaking floor. Just that slow, steady movement like she was gliding, though she wasn't. Her feet moved like anyone else's. Her heels lifted, toes pushed off the carpet. She didn't look at me or at my mom. She just passed by and kept going, out of sight behind the couch I was lying on. Toward the kitchen, maybe. I couldn't see where she went after that. The strangest part was how calm I felt. I didn't feel afraid. I didn't even feel like I was supposed to be afraid. I remember lying there, watching her walk past, and feeling like it made sense somehow. Like I knew her, even though I didn't. There was something peaceful about the whole thing, almost quieting. It felt like watching someone walk past your window outside. You don't know them, but you don't question their presence either. You just let them pass. She never came back into view. My mom didn't move. I didn't either. We just lay there, each on our couch, and I eventually closed my eyes again. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because when I woke up the next morning, the sun was coming in through the windows, the room was brighter, and the house felt normal again. My mom was already up. The blanket was folded on the back of the couch. There was a smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. I got up and walked through the house slowly, almost expecting to see her again, but everything was exactly the way it always was. The hallway was empty. The kitchen was empty. The back door was locked. Nothing was out of place. No open windows. No marks on the floor. No indication that anything had happened at all. If I hadn't remembered it so clearly, I might have thought it was a dream. Years passed. I didn't talk about it. Not because I was afraid, but because it didn't seem like something that needed to be talked about. It wasn't like the ghost stories other kids told or nightmares they bragged about at school. It felt real, but not dangerous. Just something I saw one night when I was 6. We moved out of that house eventually. I was maybe 8 or 9 by then. We moved across town into a newer place with brighter walls and a bigger yard. And that old house just became part of the past. I'd think about it sometimes, especially when I couldn't sleep, but the memory never changed. It stayed exactly the same. The girl, the hallway, the way she walked past us, never hurried, never afraid, never looking up. I never saw her again. It wasn't until much later, as an adult, that I started really wondering about it. I tried to be logical. I thought maybe I'd been half asleep, maybe I dreamed it, but I remember waking up before I saw her. I remember seeing my mom look across the room first, and I remember the silence, the feeling of the blanket under my arms, the couch pressing into my shoulder. Those are the kind of things I don't think you feel in a dream. I even asked my mom once, years later. I didn't tell her exactly what I saw, just asked her if she remembered sleeping in the living room. She paused like she had to think, and then said she did. But she didn't go into detail. Maybe she didn't remember. Or maybe she did and just didn't want to talk about it. Some things are like that. They sit quietly in the corners of our minds, untouched, but always there. The thing is, I don't think it was supernatural. I don't believe in that. I never did, even as a kid. There was no cold air, no flickering lights, no creepy sounds. Just a girl walking. No message, no purpose that I could see. And that's what made it so strange. It wasn't scary. It wasn't even sad. It was peaceful, almost beautiful in a weird way. Like watching leaves fall or rain slide down a window. It happened, and then it was gone. Over time, I wondered if it was something more grounded. Maybe I saw a neighbor's kid who had somehow wandered into the house. But how would she have gotten in? The doors were locked. The windows were closed. Nothing was missing. And she didn't act like someone lost or looking for help. She just passed through. Or maybe my mom knew her. Maybe she was related somehow. Someone from the past. Someone she didn't expect to see again. But that's just speculation. I'll never know. And honestly, I don't need to. Some memories are meant to be left alone. They're just fragments of something bigger. Something that doesn't need an explanation. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I'm in a quiet room or see a dark hallway. Not in fear, but in a kind of quiet reflection. I think about that little girl in the blue nightgown, walking softly, slowly, calmly through our living room. I think about the way she didn't look at me, didn't seem to notice I was there. And I wonder, not with fear but with curiosity, what she saw, what she felt where she was going. I don't need an answer. Some things are real whether you can explain them or not. Some memories live longer than logic, and some moments don't belong to fear or reason. They just are. Like that night. Like her. A quiet figure moving through a quiet house. Peaceful. Still. And gone. It was late summer, just past the middle of August, the kind of time when the air starts to shift just slightly at night, reminding you that fall is around the corner even though the days are still hot. I lived in a small town not too far from Calgary, surrounded by stretches of undeveloped land that separated neighborhoods like quiet no man's lands. It was one of those towns where you knew half the people just by the cars in their driveways, and everyone left their porch lights on even if they weren't home. The nights could feel dead quiet, but not in a peaceful way. More like everything was waiting for something to happen. My friend and I were out late that night. It was just after 11, and we had the sort of restless energy that comes with being bored in a place that feels like it's always asleep. We've been walking around for a while, not doing anything in particular, mostly just wandering and talking. We passed by the edge of one of those undeveloped plots of land. Just open space filled with patches of wild grass, hard-packed dirt, and broken fence lines. We've been out there before during the day. It was a kind of nothing area, but it gave us something to explore when the streets felt too still. The fence was there, a sagging line of rusty barbed wire strung between crooked wooden posts. It wasn't built to keep anything serious out, just a lazy boundary. We had a system for getting through it. My friend would hold down the wire just low enough that I could swing my leg over without getting sliced. Then I'd hold it for him. We did it enough times that it didn't even feel risky anymore. That night was no different. We slipped through the wire, shoes scraping dirt, hands steadying ourselves on the weathered wood, and then we were on the other side. The land opened up past the fence. It wasn't completely flat, more like rolling mounds of dirt and sparse weeds, with the occasional bush or low tree. There was one particular dirt hill in the middle of it, bigger than the rest, like someone had tried to start a construction project and just left it halfway. We'd climbed it before during the day. It gave a view of the whole area and a little beyond, down toward the tree line that marked the next neighborhood over. We made our way up the hill that night, the dirt dry and loose underfoot. Each step kicked up fine dust that stuck to the sweat on our legs. The climb was slow, not because it was hard, but because we were trying to stay quiet. There wasn't any real reason to be careful. We just felt like we should be. The sky above us was clear, the stars bright and sharp against the deep blue. It was one of those nights where you could see your shadow, even without a moon, just from the haze of the sky glow coming off the town behind us. When we reached the top of the dirt hill, we were about to just sit and rest, maybe slide down the other side for fun like we had in the past. But what we saw stopped us cold. At the bottom of the hill, maybe 50 feet out, was a cluster of tents. Not 2 or 3, more like 12, maybe more, all arranged in an uneven half circle. They weren't the clean kind you'd see at a campground either. These were beat up, mismatched, all kinds of colors and shapes. Some had tarps thrown over them, weighed down with bricks. Others were partially collapsed. A few were just makeshift shelters, patched together with plastic and scrap metal. It looked more like a hidden camp than a campsite. We both hit the dirt without speaking, just dropped flat, like animals spotting a predator. I could feel the rough grit digging into my arms and chest, but I didn't move. My heart had started to thump in that way it does when you realize something is off, but you haven't figured out how bad it is yet. We stayed still, just watching, not saying anything. From where we were, we couldn't hear much. Just the distant hum of town and the occasional breeze that rustled the weeds around us. But we could see shapes moving inside the camp, shadows flitting between tents. A dim light coming from one of the structures flickered like a candle or maybe a weak lantern. It was hard to tell who was down there or how many people, but there were definitely people. And not just passing through. They were living there. About 15 or 20 minutes passed, and we were still lying on the hill, too nervous to move. I had dirt in my mouth from breathing through the ground, and my legs were starting to cramp. That's when one of them stepped out of the tent closest to us. He was a tall guy, not huge, but bigger than average, with a thick ginger beard and long, messy hair. He scratched his side, stumbled a bit, and then turned away from the camp and started taking a piss right into the weeds. We didn't move a muscle. He was maybe 20 feet from us, and if he'd turned even halfway in our direction, he would have seen us outlined against the sky. But he didn't. He finished up, spat into the dirt, and stumbled back into the tent like nothing had happened. I started to feel that pressure building in my chest, the kind that comes with wanting to run, but knowing you can't yet. We couldn't just get up and leave. Not yet. The camp was too close, and we didn't know how many people were still awake. That's when the cart showed up. From the far side of the camp, I saw lights bounce across the ground. Too bright to be flashlights, too low to be a car. Then I heard it. The low hum of an electric motor, faint at first, but getting louder. A motorized golf cart appeared, outfitted with a spotlight mounted on the front. Someone had rigged it with a bracket, probably to sweep the area as they drove. There were at least 2 people on it. One was driving, the other scanning the ground ahead. They were doing a patrol. That was the moment I realized this wasn't some random group of squatters. This was organized. It wasn't just people hiding out. It was people defending something. I shifted my body slightly, trying to get lower, scraping my stomach in the dirt. The spotlight wasn't pointed directly at us, but it was coming our way, slowly panning side to side. The cart moved closer, maybe 30 feet out. I could hear them talking, not clearly, just a rise and fall of voices. The cart passed below us, the light sweeping left, then right. When it came close, I held my breath and pressed my face to the dirt, hoping the weeds around us were enough to keep us hidden. The light missed us by a few feet, and the cart kept moving. As soon as it was out of range, we both shifted and started crawling backward, away from the top of the hill. We didn't stand yet, just slid down the side opposite the camp, letting gravity pull us until we were far enough to run without being seen. We bolted, legs burning, shoes slipping on the loose dirt, breath loud in our ears. The only thought in my head was to get to the fence. It wasn't far, maybe 100 yards, but it felt like miles. The land blurred past in the dark, shapes of bushes and scattered rocks catching the corner of my vision. My lungs burned, but I didn't slow down. We were almost at the fence when I heard it. A voice behind us, sharp, angry, and close. I couldn't make out the exact words, but I didn't need to. Someone had seen us, and they were coming. I didn't look back. I just pushed harder, legs pumping, heart racing. The fence came into view, the barbed wire glinting faintly in the dark. My friend reached it first and dropped down to hold the wire. I stepped through, careful but fast, snagging my shirt a little, but not enough to stop. I held it for him, and he scrambled through behind me. Then we ran again, past the wire, onto the road, feet pounding the pavement. The sound of pursuit faded behind us, but we didn't trust it. We didn't stop, not until we reached his house, chest heaving, soaked in sweat, lungs on fire. We stood there for a long time, just catching our breath, staring at the street like we expected someone to come running around the corner. But no one did. That night, we didn't talk much. We went inside, shut the door, and stayed quiet. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the camp, the tents, the man with the beard, and the sweeping light of the cart. I kept replaying the moment someone shouted, the tone of it, like they were ready to kill us just for seeing what we saw. The next day, we walked past that area from the road. In daylight, it looked normal. Just dirt and weeds. No sign of the tents. They were deeper in, hidden well. And we never went back. We never told anyone either. Not really. I think we both understood that whatever was going on in that field wasn't something we were supposed to see. It wasn't just homeless people. It was something else. Something organized, guarded, and hidden. Months passed, then years. I still think about that night. I wonder who they were, why they were there, and what would have happened if we'd been caught. I wonder what that place turned into, or if it's still there, hidden just out of sight from a town that likes to pretend nothing bad ever happens. But I never went back, and I never will. I don't remember exactly how old I was when it happened, but if I had to guess, I'd say somewhere between 14 and 17. It was during the years when I still lived in that house at the end of a short dead-end street in a tiny town that most people have never heard of. One of those places where everyone knows everyone else's name and nothing much ever happens. The kind of town where people leave their doors unlocked during the day and kids ride bikes in the middle of the road without worrying about traffic. It was the kind of place where things weren't supposed to go wrong. Our house wasn't anything special, just a single-story home with 3 bedrooms, yellow siding that was starting to peel a little in the corners, and a small front porch with one of those plastic chairs that faded in the sun. It sat maybe 20 feet back from the street, with a patchy lawn in the front that was more dirt than grass. We had a chain-link fence that was rusted in some places and bent in others, and the mailbox had been knocked crooked years ago and never fixed. It was a plain house in a plain town, but it was where I grew up, so I didn't think much about it at the time. My bedroom was all the way at the end of the hallway, the one furthest from the kitchen and living room. It was the only bedroom that faced the street. I used to hate that, especially at night. It always made me feel exposed, like I was being watched from the dark road outside, even though the odds of anyone being out there were low. Still, I could never shake that feeling. There was something about that room that just didn't sit right with me, and I always felt more nervous at night when I was in there alone. What helped more than anything was my cat. Her name was Cleo, short for Cleopatra, though I don't think anyone ever called her that. She was a thin little tabby with a raspy meow and a missing tip on her left ear. She wasn't particularly cuddly, but she had this way of just being there when I needed her. She didn't like being kept inside all the time, so we let her come and go as she pleased. At night, if she wasn't already in the house, she'd scratch at my window screen until I opened it to let her in. That night wasn't especially different from the others. It was a weekend, probably a Saturday. It was sometime between 10 and 11, maybe a little closer to 11. My parents were still awake, probably watching something in the living room or doing dishes. I don't remember. I was in my room with the lights off, just the glow of my phone screen lighting up my face, scrolling through apps without really looking at anything. I kept glancing toward the window, half expecting Cleo to show up and scratch, but she didn't. The longer I waited, the more restless I got. I don't know why I was so eager for her to come back in that night. It wasn't especially stormy or cold outside. I didn't have anything bad happen that day, but the air in my room felt heavy. I had that same creeping sensation I'd had so many nights before, like I was being watched or like someone was standing just out of sight, waiting. Eventually, I got up, shoved my phone in my pocket, and decided to go outside to call for her. I wasn't wearing shoes, just a pair of socks, so I slid them off by the door and stepped out barefoot. The concrete of the front porch was still holding a bit of warmth from the day, but the air was cooler. The kind of cool that sinks slowly into your skin and makes you feel a little too aware of your surroundings. Everything outside was quiet, not silent. There were the usual summer sounds of insects and the occasional breeze, but the kind of quiet that makes you notice how loud your own breathing is. I stepped off the porch and onto the dry grass, walking a few feet out into the yard. The streetlight across from our house had a yellow glow that flickered every so often, and it didn't do a great job lighting the road. I stood just outside the reach of the porch light and started calling softly for Cleo. I said her name a few times and did that high-pitched "here, kitty kitty" thing everyone does when calling cat. I kept my voice low. I wasn't worried about waking anyone up. Our nearest neighbors were older and hard of hearing, but the stillness of the night made me feel like I had to be quiet. I walked around a bit, glancing under the car, looking near the bushes by the side of the house, and checking the fence line, but I didn't see her. After maybe a minute or two, I gave up. It wasn't unusual for her to stay out later. Sometimes she wouldn't come back in until the early morning. She was smart enough to take care of herself. I turned around, ready to head back inside. That's when I saw him. There was a man standing behind me. He was close. So close that if I'd taken one step backward, I would have bumped into him. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring. I don't even remember hearing footsteps. He hadn't said anything, hadn't made a sound. One moment I was alone, and the next, there he was. He looked old. Not ancient, but maybe in his late 60s or early 70s. He had gray hair that was thin on top and longer in the back, curling around his ears. He wore a brown coat, even though it wasn't cold out, and the collar was stained like it had been worn every day for years. His eyes were dark, deep set, and his face had this tired, almost hollow look. He didn't seem drunk. He didn't look confused. Just blank. For what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, I stared at him. He stared back. Neither of us moved. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I didn't say anything. I turned around slowly, walked up the porch steps, opened the door, and went inside. I didn't slam the door. I didn't lock it right away. I just closed it behind me and stood there with my hand still on the knob. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. My legs felt weak, but I didn't collapse or anything. I just stood in the hallway, not sure what I was supposed to do. I knew I should tell my parents, but for some reason, I didn't want to. I felt embarrassed, or maybe afraid that if I said it out loud, it would make it more real. I stood there for what was probably only a couple of minutes, but felt like half an hour. Eventually, I told my dad. As soon as the words were out of my mouth, he jumped up, angry in that way dads get when something might be threatening their kid. He grabbed a flashlight and went outside, yelling out into the night and stomping around the yard. He walked up and down the sidewalk, shining the light behind bushes, checking around the car and under the porch. But there was no one there. Nothing out of place. Just quiet again. I stood in the doorway and watched him, too afraid to step back outside. He never found anyone. We never heard anything after that. There weren't any reports of prowlers or break-ins. Nothing on the town bulletin board. Nothing in the paper. And in a town as small as ours, even a stray dog would get mentioned at church the next day. But no one had seen anyone strange that night, and no one was missing or arrested. It was like that man had just appeared behind me and vanished the moment I went inside. At the time, I try not to think too much about it. I told myself he was probably just some old man who got confused. Maybe someone passing through town. Maybe he thought he was at someone else's house. Maybe he was drunk or sick or had dementia. I ran through every excuse I could think of, and for a while that helped. I even convinced myself that maybe I'd imagined how close he'd really been. But over the years, I've thought about it more and more. And the more I think about it, the worse it feels. He was in our yard, not near the sidewalk, not near the street. He was 15 feet from our front door, right in the middle of the yard. And he wasn't approaching the house. He wasn't walking up to knock or ask for directions. He was standing behind me, not moving, not making a sound, just standing there. There were no strange cars in front of our house. No one parked nearby, and we lived at the end of a dead-end street, with no reason for anyone to pass through unless they lived there. If he had walked from somewhere, he'd have had to walk a long way in the dark, and no one else saw him. I lived in that town for 20 more years, and I never saw that man again. Not at the grocery store, not at the gas station, not at a parade or a school event or in church. Not once. In a town where everyone knows everyone. He didn't belong. And that's what scares me the most. He wasn't supposed to be there. There was no reason for him to be that close to me, silently, in the dark. No reason for him to be standing in our yard behind a teenager calling for a cat. I think about what might have happened if I hadn't turned around when I did. If I had kept looking for Cleo just a few seconds longer. If I had gone around the side of the house. If I hadn't gone back inside immediately. I think about all the possibilities that never happened. All the what-ifs. And I realize now that the scariest part isn't what happened that night. It's what didn't. Because I'll never know why he was there. I'll never know what he wanted. And I'll never know how close I came to something I might not have walked away from. But I do know that since that night, I've never gone outside after dark without looking behind me first. I always check the yard. I always lock the door, even in broad daylight. And I haven't forgotten his face. I don't think I ever will. I wasn't even planning to go to the panda park that day. It just happened, like most of the unsettling things that stick in your mind for too long. We were in Chengdu for a week. Part of this tour thing my parents signed us up for, half shopping, half educational cultural exposure, which really meant we went wherever the tour bus dropped US and followed our guide around with cameras, while my parents handled whatever side meetings they had lined up. That day was hotter than usual. The kind of hot that sticks to your back and makes your shirt cling to your spine, even when you're standing still. The air was humid, thick like soup, and it smelled faintly of wet stone, bamboo, and something sweet and sharp from one of the street vendors across from the park gates. My guide's name was Anchi. She was probably in her early 20s, fit, and she moved quickly. She'd been walking us through department stores and souvenir stands all morning, flipping between Mandarin and English like a switch. She didn't talk too much, didn't try to be bubbly or weirdly friendly like some guides do. I like that. My parents had a meeting with some official that afternoon, something to do with a development project. I wasn't interested, and neither was Anchi. So she asked if I wanted to kill some time at the panda park, since it was only 10 minutes away. I shrugged. Sure, why not? The Chengdu research base of giant panda breeding, people just called it the panda park, was like a giant zoo, but almost entirely focused on pandas. Not just the black and white giants, but also the smaller red pandas. The place was surrounded by tall trees and dense green hedges. The air smelled cleaner inside the gates, cooler somehow, even though it was still hot. The crowds weren't too bad either, probably because it was midweek. Lots of tourists with cameras, kids on school trips, old ladies with wide-brim hats, everyone moving in slow, lazy loops between the shaded pavilions and enclosures. We took a long loop through the main areas, stopping to watch the giant pandas lying around like tired dogs. Most of them just slept, occasionally rolling over or swatting at bamboo. Some were in shaded indoor pens with glass walls. Others were outside under little wooden platforms built like playgrounds. People crowded around for pictures, but it never got chaotic. I first noticed a man in a trench coat near one of the shaded gazebos. It wasn't what he was wearing that caught my eye. Trench coats aren't that strange in China, even in summer, since people wear all sorts of layers to block the sun. It was just the way he moved, the way he was standing. At first I thought maybe he was looking at one of the pandas through the crowd, or just staring at the information sign posted on a stone pillar. But as I glanced over again, I realized he was staring straight in our direction. Not at the pandas, at us. He was older, probably in his mid to late 40s, with sickly pale skin that looked like paper soaked in milk. His hair was slicked back, greasy at the roots, and he had a long face with deep creases on either side of his mouth. His lips were thin and pressed tight, like he was holding back a smirk or trying not to say something. He held a black umbrella above his head. Not one of those floral or cartoon ones the locals carry around, but something stiff and plain, matte black with a curved wooden handle. It didn't look cheap. He kept his eyes on us as we walked by. I didn't say anything. He didn't follow us immediately. I just noted it. It's something I tend to do, watch people, scan them for weird details. I don't trust easily, even if I don't always act like it. We kept walking, took a path through a quieter part of the park. Fewer people, more trees. A little stream ran alongside the gravel path, shallow and clear, with round stones in the bottom and fallen, leaves floating slowly over them. We passed another couple of panda enclosures, one for juveniles, one for the elderly ones that didn't move much. I started to forget about the man. Then I saw him again, across a small footbridge, standing on the far side of a split in the trail. Same black umbrella, same trench coat, just standing there, still under the shade of some trees, the umbrella not even needed at that moment. He was angled like he was pretending to look past us at something else, but his eyes were unmistakably locked on us. On me, actually. I didn't say anything still. Didn't want to seem paranoid, but I kept turning around every so often. Not directly, just glancing behind us with quick turns of my head. I'd spot him, then he'd vanish again into the background, like he was timing his movement with ours. Always just far enough away to seem like a coincidence, but never completely out of sight for too long. After a while, I saw him do something odd. We were walking through a wide clearing where the sun beat down hard. Most people used umbrellas or walked along the edge in the shade. This guy, he came out of shade with his umbrella fully opened, walked a few yards into the sun, then paused and lowered the umbrella slightly, then raised it again, walked some more. Each time he entered direct sunlight, he'd hesitate, like it physically bothered him. His skin looked worse up close, thin and almost shiny. Not sweaty, just unnatural, like something kept in a cold box. At one point, we reached the red panda area. A raised path curved around their enclosure with leafy trees and vines hanging down. They were more active than the giant pandas, climbing, sniffing things, jumping across branches. We paused there for a long time. I liked that section. It felt quieter, more hidden from the rest of the park. But the path that led away from the red pandas was nearly deserted. It was narrower, lined with high hedges and a low railing separating us from a ditch filled with rocks and bamboo. I started to get this sensation in the back of my neck, like a pressure under the skin. That low, mechanical hum of something not quite right, like a light bulb flickering just before it pops. When we rounded the curve and started down that path, I saw him again. The man in the coat was standing at the far end of it, where the path opened back up near another snack stand. He stood completely still, umbrella open, blocking the sun overhead, even though he was already in the shadow of a tree. He didn't move, didn't fidget, just stared at us as we walked. And now it was obvious. He wasn't pretending to be a tourist. He wasn't blending in. He was just watching. Something about the way he looked at us turned my stomach. Not the kind of look someone gives when they're curious or confused. It was blank, hungry, like the way a lizard watches a fly. Cold and emotionless, but fixed with disturbing intent. I didn't feel fear exactly, not yet. Just a growing realization that he wasn't just strange. He was wrong. I kept pretending to enjoy the walk, but I was fully alert now, every muscle half tensed. My guide didn't say anything, but I could tell she noticed too. Her pace changed just slightly, more brisk, less casual, like she was walking us away from something without wanting to seem like she was running. The next few sections of the park were more crowded again. I kept scanning the people. I didn't see the man for a while. Thought maybe we'd lost him. But near the koi pond, I caught him again, just his shoulder and umbrella edge visible through the trees off to the left side. Always hovering. Always just out of direct confrontation. The last section of the park led back toward the exit plaza. You had to pass through a shaded area with a gift shop and a small cafe. We stopped to get drinks. I took a bench facing the exit path. I wanted to see who was coming and going. I scanned every face. Nothing. A few minutes passed. Then I saw him. He walked slowly toward the cafe patio, but not close enough to sit down or interact with anyone. He stopped at the edge of the path, turned, and faced me. His umbrella blocked part of his face at first. Then he tilted it back just a little. That's when he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. His teeth, there was something off about them. Not rotten, not fake, just sharp. Not in a cartoonish way. Real sharp, but uneven, like his canines were worn down into points, and the front ones were cracked or jagged at the edges, like someone had broken a bottle and lined up the shards. He nodded at me, a slow, precise gesture, then turned and walked away. That was it. He didn't follow us out. I didn't see him again after that. We left the park, got on the shuttle, and met up with my parents an hour later. I didn't tell them. I didn't know how. It wasn't illegal for someone to follow you in a public park, and nothing actually happened, but the feeling stayed with me. For days, even after we left Chengdu and went on to other cities, I kept thinking about that man. His stillness, his expression, the unnatural way he moved in the sunlight, and those teeth. I don't believe in vampires. I don't believe in monsters. But I do believe that some people are wired differently. People who hunt without raising a hand, who study the way others walk, calculate shadows and footpaths, and wait for a moment that never comes, or maybe almost does. I wonder what would have happened if we'd taken a quieter path. If I had walked off for a second. If my guide had ducked into the bathroom and left me alone by the rail. I think he was waiting for something like that. Waiting for a gap. But it never came. That's all. I still think about his face sometimes. Not because I'm scared of it, but because I never saw anything quite like it again. That cold, unreadable hunger. I didn't see a vampire. I saw something worse. Something real. My mom opened a small wholesale bakery in the in-laws' quarters of a family friend's home. It was an old addition, like a mini apartment attached to the side of the house. Kitchen, bathroom, small living room, and a bedroom. Perfect setup. It had its own separate entrance, which made it ideal for running a business without interrupting the main household. The man who owned the house, Gary, was a quiet, middle-aged guy who'd lived there all his life. I met him once or twice before when my mom was first talking about starting the bakery. He seemed nice enough. A little stiff, maybe, but he was generous with the space, only asked for a small rent contribution and utilities, and seemed eager to help. He lived in the main part of the house. His mother had passed away maybe 6 or 7 months before we moved the baking equipment in. According to my mom, he'd been her caretaker for the last 20 years. She was very old when she passed. I don't think anyone was surprised that she was gone. Just that Gary hadn't really changed much since. The house still looked the same, like she was still living in it. Same plastic runners on the carpet, doilies on every flat surface. The same faint smell of rose lotion and something sour underneath it that you couldn't place. I was there almost every day that first summer helping my mom bake. We were still trying to build a client base, so the hours were long. Mostly early mornings into mid-afternoon, packing bulk pastry orders and prepping cakes. It was hot, even with the AC unit Gary had installed in the wall. My mom was in her element. She'd been dreaming about this for years. I was mostly muscle, moving trays, cleaning up, boxing orders. I didn't go into the main house unless I had to use the bathroom. The one in the bakery quarters was small and never flushed quite right. I'd go through the connecting door to use the one in the hallway outside the main kitchen. That's when I started to feel weird. I noticed it the first time I went in there alone. It was early morning. My mom had run to the store for more sugar. I was working on cleaning baking trays, scraping hardened dough off the corners when I felt something shift in the room. Not temperature, not movement, just something intangible. Like you walked into a room someone had just left, but the air hadn't settled yet. It came with a tightness in my chest that I couldn't shake. No sound, nothing visual, just the sense of being looked at. It happened fast, like a passing cloud. I finished cleaning and went to the bathroom. The hallway was dim. Gary didn't turn the lights on much, just left the windows open with the curtains drawn. I passed his living room, saw the same thick furniture you only ever see in houses where very old people lived. Floral couches, overstuffed chairs, embroidered pillows with sayings like "God bless this home." I didn't think much of it then, just figured I was tired. A few weeks passed. We got busier. Orders picked up. I got used to the early mornings. The weirdness stuck around, but it was manageable. I didn't feel watched constantly, just every now and then. Mostly when I was alone. My mom didn't notice anything off. She was too busy, too focused. Then one afternoon in July, everything changed. It was a Sunday. One of those days where even early in the morning the air feels heavy. My mom had gone to deliver a few boxes to a client across town. I was in the bakery space alone, cleaning up. I remember looking up at the clock and thinking the second hand looked too fast, like time was skipping. Then I blinked and everything around me shifted. Not physically, but my head filled with something that wasn't mine. Out of nowhere, I saw this woman. Not in front of me, inside me, like a memory I'd never had. She was screaming. I couldn't understand most of it. A few words here and there in English. "Where is he?" Over and over. But most of it was this intense mix of language I didn't recognize. Later I would learn it was Serbian. Maybe some Russian too. I never studied either, but the rhythm was sharp and fast and demanding. She was yelling so hard her voice cracked. Her hands moved in frantic, jerky motions like she was scolding me. She wore this old-fashioned green and yellow dress. Her hair was thin, pulled into a tight knot at the back of her head. Her face was sharp, with deep lines carved around her mouth and eyes. The image of her filled my head so fast, I dropped the tray I was holding. It crashed to the floor, but the noise felt distant. My ears rang. She was in my head for what felt like 5 full minutes. Every time I moved, she was there, standing in the corner, in the reflection of the oven door, behind the doorway to the hall. Always yelling, always asking, "Where is he?" Then she said something I understood clear as day. Tell him to move on. After that, she added something else. Get rid of the dresses. I had no idea what that meant, but the words clung to me. They repeated again and again, bouncing in my skull. It was all I could hear, even when my mom came back. The feeling stayed with me for hours. I didn't tell her anything. What would I even say? That I was hallucinating an old Serbian woman screaming in my head in a language I didn't know? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, she was there again behind my eyelids. Same words, same tone. The next day, I made up an excuse to leave early. My mom was getting used to me flaking out sometimes, so she didn't push. I sat in my car in the bakery driveway, trying to calm myself down. That's when I saw Gary walk out of the house and into the garage. I'd never seen him use a garage before. It looked packed to the ceiling with boxes and old furniture. Something made me get out and peek around the side of the open garage door. I stood just outside his view looking in. Inside were racks of clothing, dozens of old dresses, the kind you only see on grandmothers or in thrift stores. Floral patterns, faded pastels, long sleeves, synthetic fabric. They were hung neatly, side by side, some with protective bags over them. Next to them were several boxes stacked with old shoes, handkerchiefs, scarves. Something clicked in my head. The dresses. I left right away. Later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. It lined up too well. I hadn't known about the dresses. No one told me, but I'd seen them in my head before I saw them in real life. It felt too specific to be coincidence. I decided to ask my mom about Gary's mom. I didn't tell her everything, just asked about what she was like. She said she'd only met her a few times, but that she was from Serbia originally, and that she spoke a mix of languages when she got frustrated: Serbian, Russian, English. Sometimes all in one sentence. I didn't sleep well that week. I started avoiding the bakery when I could. Something about the place made my skin crawl now, especially when I was alone. I didn't see the woman again, not like that first day, but I felt her. I kept catching glimpses of her in my peripheral vision. The heat didn't help. The air felt heavy all the time. Then one day, I broke. Gary had come into the bakery to bring us a package that had been delivered to his front door. He was being polite, smiling stiffly, asking how business was. I nodded, trying to act normal. Then, out of nowhere, I asked him what his mother looked like. He tilted his head, confused. I tried to play it off, said I'd seen a photo somewhere, and was curious. He left and came back 5 minutes later with a photo in a cracked gold frame. I froze. It was her. Same face. Same expression. Same green and yellow dress. I couldn't breathe. I think I backed away instinctively. He looked at me funny and asked if I was okay. I made something up and went outside. I sat in my car for a long time. I didn't cry. I just stared at the dashboard and tried to think logically. I tried to come up with a way I could have seen that photo before. Maybe it was on a wall somewhere in the hallway. Maybe I'd seen it in a dream and forgot. Maybe I was just under stress. But I hadn't. I asked my mom if she'd ever seen that picture. She said no. I asked if Gary had ever shown her photos of his mother. She said no. It didn't stop there. That image, the woman yelling, pointing, kept coming back for weeks after. Always the same message. He needs to let go. Move on. Get rid of the dresses. Forgive the other children. I didn't even know he had siblings. My mom later told me that yes, he had two, a brother and a sister. She didn't know them, but apparently there was bad blood after the mother died. Something about the house and money. They weren't helping with anything. One of them had tried to sell a bunch of her stuff behind his back. And here I was, being screamed at by a woman I'd never met about things I had no way of knowing. Eventually, I stopped going to the bakery. I didn't give a real reason. I just said I was burnt out. My mom didn't push. A few months later, she moved the bakery to a commercial kitchen space closer to downtown. Business had grown enough to justify the cost. I never went back to that house. Not even to visit. A year later, I still think about that summer more than I want to. I don't have an explanation for what happened. I've tried to rationalize it. I've Googled grief, hallucinations, ancestral trauma, even early signs of schizophrenia. Nothing adds up. But here's the part one always come back to. I didn't know about the dresses. I didn't know about the family fights. I didn't even know what the woman looked like. And yet I saw her, heard her, knew what she wanted. After we moved out, my mom told me Gary had started donating his mom's clothes. Slowly at first, then all at once. She said he looked lighter. Not happier, exactly, but less hollow. Every summer, our family makes the long trip down to Argentina. It's not a vacation like most people think when I say that. It's not beaches or sightseeing or museums. My dad has family land in the mountains up north, and we go there to get away from everything. No phones, no internet, no neighbors. Just dirt trails, old trees, and wide open sky. We keep an old Jeep Wrangler up there. It's beat up and rusted in a few spots, with a fiberglass body and knobby tires, but it still runs strong. That Jeep is what makes it fun. We take it mudding every chance we get. There's no real roads where we are, just ruts and trails that disappear into thick brush or wrap around hills, so steep you feel like the Jeep might tip over backwards. It's the kind of place where you don't get help if something goes wrong. You just figure it out or hike for hours. We've had that Jeep for years. My dad fixed it up with me when I was a kid. Changed the suspension, added a winch up front, even bolted on a second battery. He painted it once, just spray paint straight from the can. Flat green. That's all it needed. This story happened the summer I turned 19. It was early July. That year, winter hit the mountains a little harder than usual. We were over 8,000 feet up, and even though it was summer back home, it still dropped to near freezing at night where we were. You could see your breath if you stepped outside after sunset. Some days we'd build fires just to cook because it kept us warmer than using the stove. One night, my dad and I got the idea to take the Jeep out late. Just the two of us. It wasn't planned. We were outside, checking the tires and topping off fluids, and I guess we both wanted something to break the silence. The others, my mom, my sister, her boyfriend, they had all gone to sleep. There was a full moon out and hardly any clouds, which meant the light was good enough to see without headlights, especially with snow patches reflecting it off the hills. We didn't even talk about where to go. We just got in and started driving. I had a hoodie on, a beanie pulled low, gloves that didn't match, and a scarf wrapped around my neck. Still felt the cold. The Jeep's heater barely worked, so the only warm part of the ride was near the floor by the engine. We drove for a while, took the trail that wrapped around the western ridge, then dipped into the valley. After maybe 40 minutes, we found ourselves near the old cementerio, the abandoned cemetery. It wasn't the first time we'd seen it. In daylight, it didn't look like much. A rectangle of crumbling stone fencing and cracked slabs that used to be headstones. Some of them had fallen over. Some had been looted. The cemetery hadn't been used in decades. Maybe longer. Nobody came out this way except idiots in Jeeps. That night, the ground was hard from frost, which made it perfect for off-roading. Mud wasn't an issue. You could peel through the cemetery's edge without getting bogged down. So we did, just messing around, taking turns spinning circles, stopping and backing up, crawling over piles of broken stone and concrete. The whole thing was flat except for a small hill on the northern edge where a few dead trees still stood. Most were bare and cracked at the base. We spent what felt like an hour just tearing around in that graveyard. We weren't disrespecting anything. We were just driving, doing what people do when they're trying to burn some energy and forget that it's cold as hell outside. My dad liked pushing the Jeep to its limit. I liked watching the way the suspension flexed and how the headlights danced on the broken headstones. Then we stopped. I don't know why. Maybe we were out of dumb ideas. Maybe we were just tired. My dad killed the engine, and the silence dropped down like a curtain. No bugs, no wind, just a flat, frozen hush that settled in every direction. We both stepped out. My boots hit the frosted ground and crunched. I stretched my arms over my head, breathing out and watching the mist of it float up toward the trees. Then, for no real reason, I looked up toward the moon. It was directly overhead, glowing white with a kind of brightness that looked almost fake. like someone cut a hole in the sky. And then I saw them. Stones. Flying through the air. At first, I thought it was leaves, but there were no trees above us. And I thought maybe birds, tiny ones, were swooping. But they didn't flap. They didn't dive or change direction. They were spinning, tumbling through the air with speed, as if something launched them. And then they hit. A loud, sharp crack rang out as one of them smacked the Jeep's fiberglass hood. Then another. Then several at once. I ducked, covered my head with both arms, and backed toward the Jeep. They were flying in from the same direction, the hillside with the dead trees. Hundreds of them. I'm not exaggerating. Hundreds. I didn't stop to think. Neither did my dad. We both scrambled into the Jeep, slammed the doors, and started the engine. I heard more impacts, louder now, faster, popping like corn in a microwave. Stones clinking off the roof and bouncing off the windshield. One of them cracked the side mirror. Another chipped the fiberglass panel on the passenger side. We didn't wait to figure out what the hell was happening. We backed up, tires spinning on frost, and took the fastest trail out of there. The road was narrow and crooked, but we didn't slow down. Not until we were halfway back to the cabin. Only then did we stop and look at the damage. The Jeep had taken a beating. The passenger side door was dotted with scratches and a half-inch chip taken clean out near the bottom. The hood was dented. One of the headlights had a spiderweb crack through the lens. Fiberglass splinters had torn loose where the stones hit. I don't know what we expected to see when we looked back in the direction of the cemetery. There was nothing, just moonlight and the shadow of the ridge. We didn't talk. We didn't ask each other what we saw. We didn't need to. We both knew it wasn't right. We got back to the cabin, parked the Jeep, and didn't mention it again. Not the next morning. Not for the rest of the trip. Weeks passed. Then months. We flew back home at the end of summer, back to normal life. I started college that fall. My dad went back to work. The Jeep stayed in Argentina. It always does. But the next summer, when we flew down again, the Jeep was exactly where we left it. Covered in dust. Still dented. Still chipped. Fiberglass scars that didn't fade with time. And we didn't go back to the cemetery. Not once. Not even close. Sometimes when I'm sitting at home or laying in bed late at night, I still think about it. I think about how the stones weren't falling. They were flying. Like someone or something had thrown them. But not just tossed. They came in fast. Like from a slingshot or launcher. Too fast to be natural. Too many at once. I thought maybe there was a storm. Maybe there was wind carrying gravel off the hillside. But the night was still. There was no wind. The air was cold and calm. I would have felt a gust, even the smallest one. And gravel doesn't travel like that. It doesn't stay in a tight pattern. It doesn't come from one direction in such volume. I even considered if there were people there. Hiding. Waiting. Maybe locals who didn't like outsiders messing around in the cemetery. But we didn't see anyone. We didn't hear voices or footsteps or cars. There was no sign of anyone following us. Nothing. Still, that's the only explanation I can make peace with. That maybe someone was there. Maybe a group of people. Locals. Kids. Farmers. Whoever. Maybe they saw us tearing up a place they cared about. Maybe they waited until we stopped, until we let our guard down, and decided to scare the hell out of us. And it worked, because we never went back. Every now and then, I still walk out to the garage where we keep our newer Jeep, the one we use at home, and I look at it, thinking about the other one sitting under a tarp in Argentina, still marked by whatever happened that night. The chips in the fiberglass never got fixed. My dad doesn't want to fix them. He says the Jeep runs fine and the damage doesn't affect how it drives. But I know he leaves them on purpose. Like a warning. Like a reminder. There are stories that people make up about things they've seen. Ghosts. Creatures. Voices in the dark. But what happened that night wasn't a story. It wasn't fantasy. It wasn't made up. It was cold. It was real. It happened in the mountains of Argentina, under a full moon, in the middle of an abandoned cemetery with no one around for miles. And it left a mark. Not just on the Jeep. On me too. I don't scare easy. I've hiked alone, camped in remote places, been through storms and accidents and breakdowns. But nothing has ever stuck with me like that moment when I looked up and saw the stones flying. To this day, when I hear a noise on the roof or the wind rattles gravel against the windows, I flinch just a little harder than I should. I remember the sound they made when they hit the Jeep. That fast, hollow clack. Over and over. unnatural in its rhythm, like someone hurling rocks with no pause, no breath, no human limitation. I'll never know for sure what caused it. Maybe it was people. Maybe it was the mountain itself. I don't believe in ghosts or fairy tales. I believe in cold and silence, in places that don't care whether you're there or not. And whatever hit us that night, it came with purpose. That's why we never went back. That's why the Jeep still wears its scars. And that's why, sometimes, when the air is still and the night is clear, I remember how small you can feel when something you can't explain decides to show itself. Not with the sound, not with the shape, but with stones, hundreds of them, thrown by nothing you can see. And I still think about that week at camp, even now, years later. Sometimes it slips into my mind when I least expect it. Walking home from work in the dark, or when I pass by a stack of old wooden pallets behind a gas station. The memory isn't something that fades. It sticks in a weird way, not because of what I saw, but because of how real it was. How close it came to being something worse. I was in grade 8. It was that awkward time in your life when everything feels like it matters way more than it should, and you're just starting to figure out who you are. Our class was going on this big trip, a week at a camp in the woods with cabins, a lake, hiking trails, and those wooden towers with climbing walls. Everyone was excited, acting like it was going to be the best thing ever. For me, I was just happy to be away from home for a bit. Things weren't great there. My parents had been fighting a lot, and the idea of sleeping somewhere quiet felt like a break I didn't even know I needed. We got there on a Monday morning. The bus ride was loud, kids laughing and yelling and tossing snacks around. I remember the camp smelled like pine and damp earth. The cabins were old but solid, wooden frames, bunk beds with thin mattresses, little screened windows with roll-down blinds. They told us not to wander at night, not to go off the trails, and definitely not to swim after dark. Standard stuff. Every night, they had a fire going in the big pit at the edge of the woods. The counselors would tell ghost stories, things about the area, legends about old lumberjacks, cabins that burned down, people getting lost in the forest. Some of them were obviously fake, the kind of stuff you tell to get a reaction from kids. We laughed them off and tried to spook each other back in the cabins. Typical camp stuff. But the weird thing is, no one ever told the story about what we saw. Not even a mention of anything close to it. And that's what makes it worse in my head. Like it was something that wasn't part of the made-up stories. Like it was real and no one wanted to talk about it. It was the third night when it happened. We'd settled into our routines by then. During the day, we did canoeing, wall climbing, and little survival skill things like starting fires with flint or building shelters. At night, we goofed off in the cabins, making dumb jokes, tossing things around, trying to scare each other. There were 6 of us in our cabin. The beds were laid out in 2 rows, 3 bunks on either side. Mine was the second top bunk on the right. We had this thing where before we started messing around too much, we'd take turns checking the windows, just to make sure no counselor was walking around nearby. If we got caught being loud, they'd come in and shut us down for the night, and that would be it. No one wanted that. The cabin had 3 windows, one on each side wall and one at the back. The front door opened onto a porch that faced the main clearing where the fire pit and other cabins were. The back window looked out into trees. The cabin was built on a slope, so while the front sat maybe 3 feet off the ground, the back window was easily 10 or 15 feet up with a sharp drop into the woods behind us. That night, I remember we were about to start throwing marshmallows at each other when someone walked up to the left side window and peeked out. He froze. I can still picture the way he stood there, not saying anything, just staring. We asked him what he saw, and he stepped back and pointed out. All of us crowded around and looked. There, maybe 15 feet from the cabin, was a man sitting on a stack of wooden pallets. It looked like they'd been left there from something, maybe construction or camp maintenance. I don't know. There was no reason for them to be stacked like that in the woods. But there he was, an older man, probably in his 60s or 70s, sitting cross-legged right on top. He was facing the cabin, but not directly. His head was tilted down a bit, like he was thinking or watching something near his feet. At first, we all just stood there. It was so out of place it didn't register as dangerous. Just strange. No one moved. No one said anything. After maybe 30 seconds, Someone said we should stop fooling around since a staff member was obviously nearby. We assumed it was a maintenance guy, or maybe one of the older counselors. Still, something felt off. His clothes weren't right. He looked like he was wearing a jacket way too heavy for the weather, and dark pants that looked dirty or wet. Eventually, we drifted away from the window. We figured he'd move along or go back to whatever he was doing. It killed the mood for a bit, but kids being kids, we started quietly messing around again after 10 minutes or so. Then it was my turn to check the back window, the one no one really liked because it was high up and faced the woods. I didn't think twice about it. I walked over, pulled the blind back with 2 fingers, and looked out. The man's face was right there. His head was inches from the glass. I remember the reflection of his eyes catching the light from inside the cabin. I didn't scream. I didn't move. My body just locked up. His face wasn't angry. It wasn't smiling. It was just blank, like he was waiting for something. His skin was pale and sagging, lips slightly parted, cheeks slack like he hadn't eaten in days. I let go of the blind and backed away fast, heart pounding. I didn't say anything to the others. I just climbed in my bunk and pulled my sleeping bag up. It was like something deep inside me had flipped a switch, some part of my brain saying, "Don't draw attention to yourself." Everyone eventually settled down, but none of us really slept. You could feel it in the room, the tension, the awareness that something wasn't right. The next morning, we went outside and looked around. No footprints, no sign of the pallets, no indication anyone had been there. We told a counselor that we thought we saw someone in the woods. He brushed it off, said it was probably a ranger or a local walking through. Not to worry, but no one came by to check. No questions were asked. Nothing changed. For the rest of the trip, I avoided the windows. A few years later, my great-grandmother passed away. She was 92, and it wasn't unexpected. She'd been living in a care home for a while, mostly quiet, sometimes confused. Still, it hit harder than I thought it would. She had this way of telling stories, real stories from when she was a kid, or during the war, or about the old farm where she lived when she was young. Her mind wandered at the end, but those stories always felt like pieces of time stitched together. The visitation was on a cold fall evening. Late October, around 7 p.m. The funeral home was a low, brick building with a green roof and an old sign out front. The kind of place that had been around forever. I went with my parents. My dad drove. My mom was quiet the whole way. I don't remember much about the drive, except the sky was dark before we even got there, and the wind had picked up hard. Inside, it smelled like flowers and candles. The front room was warm and full of people. Soft piano music played from somewhere. I saw cousins I hadn't seen in years. People stood in small groups, talking in low voices, holding cups of weak coffee in foam cups. The room was brightly lit with soft yellow lights. In the middle was the casket. Open. My great-grandmother looked small, shrunken somehow. Her face was peaceful, but pale. Makeup tried to make her look normal, but it didn't quite work. I remember standing next to her for a long time. Not crying, just thinking, remembering her hands, the way they felt when she held mine. The way she always kept hard candies in her purse, wrapped in crinkly paper. Then, around 8 o'clock, the power went out. It happened fast. Everything went black, except for a few emergency lights that kicked on after a second or two. People gasped. Someone dropped a cup. The music stopped. You could hear the wind outside howling against the windows. The lights that came on were dim and red, like something you'd see in a hospital during code. They cast long shadows across the walls and floors. Everything felt wrong instantly. The room looked different. People's faces changed in that light. Softer features looked hard. The flowers looked wilted. My great-grandmother looked not peaceful anymore. The shadows made her look like she was frowning. The funeral director came out with a flashlight. He tried to make a joke about spooky timing, but no one laughed. A few people started to leave, said they had to get home, didn't want to get stuck if the weather got worse. My parents said we'd wait it out. Give a few more minutes. That was the longest half hour of my life. Something happens in a place like that when the power goes out. Your brain starts filling in the blanks. Every creak of the building, every shift of the wind becomes something worse. The coffin lid creaked a little as the pressure changed in the room. I don't think it moved, but in that moment, it felt like it did. I walked down a hallway to the restroom. The emergency lights didn't reach that far. I used a flashlight on my phone, but the beam was weak. I passed the doorway and saw a figure standing just inside, tall, unmoving. My heart jumped, but it was just a coat rack. The shadows made it look human. In the bathroom, the water didn't run. I stood in front of the mirror for a minute and just stared at myself. I looked pale, tired. The lights flickered once. Then I turned and walked quickly back to the main room. The power came back around 8:40. Lights clicked on, the music started again, and everything went back to normal. But it wasn't normal. I remember my dad saying later that power outages weren't uncommon in that area during high winds. Said the funeral home probably had a generator that needed a second to kick in. But I knew what I felt in those 30 minutes. It wasn't the dark that was scary. It was what your brain does in the dark. The way everything familiar twists. I think I was around 10 years old, maybe a few months shy of 11. At that age, everything still felt kind of blurry between reality and imagination, but I already knew that bad dreams couldn't really hurt you. People said it all the time. I'd heard it from adults at school, read it in books, even thought it myself whenever I had one of those weird dreams that left me shaken in the morning. You'd wake up, your heart pounding, your shirt damp with sweat, sometimes confused for a few seconds about where you were or what was real. But then the bed was under you, and the room was the same, and your body still worked the way it should. You were fine. That's what always happened. So that night, when the dream started, I didn't know anything was different. I was just sleeping in my bed like any other night. My room was small but comfortable. There was a wooden shelf in the corner filled with toys and dusty books I hardly touched. A half-open dresser with clothes spilling out of it. Posters on the walls of video game characters and race cars. My bed was pushed up against the far wall, under a window that looked out onto the backyard, though at night it just showed a black pane of nothingness. My comforter was worn out and covered in prints of little rockets and astronauts. I liked that blanket. It felt safe. I was in the middle of the dream before I even realized I was dreaming. That's how it usually goes. The transition is smooth. The world in the dream felt real, not in the way cartoons or games feel real, but real in the way a memory might feel when you're deep inside it. I was in our house, but it wasn't really our house. The walls were darker, not in color, but in tone, like someone had taken the light away from everything. The floors looked like the same what I walked on every day, but they felt heavier beneath my feet, like walking on stone instead of oak. I could see everything, but it felt like I was seeing it through smoke or through a glass that had fingerprints smeared all over it. And there was my older brother standing in the hallway, maybe 6 feet from me. Except it wasn't him. Not really. It was his body, his clothes, even his posture, but his face looked off. Not in a cartoonish way, like a monster, just subtly wrong. His eyes didn't have that familiar spark, and the way his mouth twitched reminded me of someone trying to hold in something they didn't want to say. He didn't talk, though. He just walked toward me, slowly, like he was taking his time. Then his hands were around my throat. There wasn't a fight. I didn't try to run. I think my dream self was just too stunned to react. Or maybe part of me knew it wasn't real. His fingers pressed down, not hard at first, but with an even pressure that started to squeeze the air out of me. I tried to yell. I tried to breathe. Nothing. My arms flailed, pushing at him, but he didn't move. His hands were cold and solid and unshakable. I could feel my lungs start to panic beneath my ribs, my mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The air wouldn't come. It felt too real. That's the thing I still remember now, even years later. The feeling of not being able to breathe didn't feel like dream logic or nightmare exaggeration. It felt like the actual thing. The tightness, the panic, the way my head started to feel fuzzy at the edges. I remember thinking in the dream, this is what it's like to die. And then I woke up. Just like that, I was back in my bed. The rockets on the blanket. The darkness outside the window. The ceiling overhead, faintly lit by the night light in the hallway. I was drenched in sweat, heart pounding, arms clutched around the pillow like it was a life raft. I remember the wave of relief that came first. The kind that pours over you like a warm bath. I thought, oh good, it's over. And then I tried to breathe. Nothing happened. That second is carved into my memory. I expected the usual post-nightmare deep breath, the kind that washes the fear away and settles your body back into the real world. But instead, I pulled in and nothing came. My chest moved, my mouth opened, but there was no air. Like the whole room had been drained of oxygen. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. I thought maybe I hadn't really woken up. That happens sometimes. You wake up in a dream inside another dream. But then the weight of the blankets was real. The cold of the sweat on my back. The sounds of the house, the low hum of the fridge downstairs, the tick of the clock near my bed. All real, but I couldn't breathe. I sat up fast, yanking the blanket off. My throat was tight like someone had tied a belt around it from the inside. It wasn't like holding your breath underwater. This was different. I wanted to breathe. My chest wanted to breathe, but nothing got in. No matter how hard I gasped or tried to suck in air, it was like there was a lid on top of my windpipe. That's when the panic really hit. It started in my stomach, a deep clench that spread through my whole body. My arm shook. My eyes started to tear up. I threw myself out of bed and stumbled toward the door, but my legs didn't work right. They were like rubber. My vision was tunneling. There was this ringing in my ears, like a high-pitched whistle that wouldn't stop. I remember clutching the edge of my dresser, trying to stay upright, slamming my hand against the doorframe. Everything felt slow and fast at the same time, like the room was spinning but also collapsing in. I thought I was dying. I didn't think it in a dramatic way. I wasn't being over the top in my head. I wasn't imagining a funeral or thinking of final words. I just knew this was it. My lungs wouldn't work. My heart was going too fast. My head was empty of air and full of heat. It was a certainty, like dropping off a cliff and seeing the ground coming up. And then suddenly there was my dad. I don't know how long he'd been there. I think he must have heard the noises. Maybe the wheezing or the thump of me hitting something. But suddenly his arm was around me, and he was pulling me out of the room. I couldn't speak. I couldn't cry. My body was in a full rebellion against itself. He got me down the stairs somehow. The living room lights were on. I remember the rough feel of the carpet under my feet, my toes curling against it as I tried to stay upright. He took me to the kitchen, where the air was cooler, and sat me down by the sink. His hand was on my back, steady, and I could feel him guiding me to take slower breaths. And slowly, so slowly, the air started to come back. It was just a sliver at first, a whisper of breath that barely registered. But it was enough. Then another. Then more. My lungs were still tight, but they were working again, little by little. My chest burned like I'd run for miles, but I could breathe. The panic eased back like the tide going out. My fingers stopped shaking. My vision cleared. I sat there, leaning forward, dripping sweat, tears on my cheeks, trying to focus on each breath like it was the only thing in the world. It wasn't the last time it happened. Not even close. Later, I learned it was asthma. I already knew I had it, but it had never been that bad before. I used an inhaler sometimes at school, like after gym class, or if I got too worked up running around. But nothing like that night. That night was different. That was the first time I realized that asthma wasn't just a thing I had. It was a thing that could kill me if it wanted to. And it scared the hell out of me. The worst part wasn't even the attack itself. It was the gap between waking up from the dream and realizing I still couldn't breathe. That moment when you think it's over, that the fear is gone, that you're safe, and then it hits you again, harder. I can still feel that moment now if I think about it long enough. That sharp jolt of betrayal, of thinking you were safe when you weren't. After that, the attacks came more often, usually at night, sometimes during the day, but the nighttime ones were always worse. The darkness made it feel bigger somehow, like the walls were closing in. I started sleeping with the door open. The window cracked, even in the winter. I kept my inhaler right next to the pillow. My dad checked on me more often. I didn't like him knowing how scared I was, but I think he already knew. Over time, I learned to recognize the signs. That tightness in the chest, the dry feeling in the throat, the weird flutter in the ribs when the air starts to feel thin. The more I learned about it, the less I panicked. I still hated it. It still scared me every time. But at least I knew I wasn't going to die. Probably. I still have asthma. It's manageable now. I'm older. I take meds. I exercise more carefully. I know how to pace myself. But even now, when I wake up from a nightmare, I always take that first breath carefully. I pay attention to it. I listen to my lungs. I wait for the air to come, just to be sure. That night never left me. Not really. It's like a scar in my memory. Not a physical one, but a psychological one. A marker. The moment when childhood stopped being a safe place, and I realized that sometimes your own body can turn against you. That not every danger comes from outside. It was just a dream, and then it wasn't. And I think that's what makes it so terrifying. Not the dream itself, but how real the fear became once I woke up. How fragile breathing really is when you think about it. How easy it is to take it for granted. 1 second, you're fine. The next, you're fighting for every inch of air like it's water in a desert. And yet I lived. I learned. I got through it. That's the part that matters. Even though it scared me more than anything ever had, I survived it. I faced that fear again and again, and I came out on the other side. I still carry it with me in a quiet way, but now it's something I understand. 2 years ago, the night before my birthday, something happened that I've never really been able to explain. I've tried to push it out of my head. I've come up with all kinds of reasons, excuses, and theories. But deep down, it still sits there, right at the edge of my memory, reminding me of something I can't fully understand. Something I probably never will. I was 17 then. It was early March, and I was still living at home with my mom and my little brother. We lived in a pretty average house in a quiet part of town. It was the kind of neighborhood where the loudest thing you'd hear at night was maybe someone's dog barking down the street or a passing car if the window was open. That day had been uneventful. I had school, came home, played some video games, and went to bed around midnight. I remember being excited for my birthday. Not because I was expecting anything big, but just because I liked the small traditions we had. Mom usually made my favorite breakfast, and sometimes we'd go out for dinner. Nothing special, but I liked that. I didn't fall asleep right away that night. I remember tossing and turning a bit. Maybe it was the excitement. Maybe I just wasn't tired. I lay there in the dark for a while, scrolling through my phone, watching videos, and checking messages until my eyes finally got too heavy. I don't remember falling asleep. I just remember the moment I woke up again. It was 2:37 a.m. I remember the exact time because I looked at my alarm clock as soon as I opened my eyes. The room was completely dark except for a faint blue glow from the clock. I had this weird, heavy feeling in my chest. Not fear exactly, just something uncomfortable, like something was off. I didn't hear any sounds. Nothing creaked. No wind, no footsteps, nothing. Just still silence. But for some reason, I felt like I had to get up. I sat up slowly. My room faced the hallway that led straight into the living room. From my bed, I could see down the hall if my door was open, and the hallway was dimly lit from the moonlight coming in through the window near the front door. I could see the soft shape of the doorway that led into the living room. It was quiet. Nothing seemed wrong at first. Then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, in the living room, there was a figure, just barely visible in the low light. I couldn't make out any details, just a shape. It looked like someone standing there, not moving, just standing. I stared at it for a few seconds, not blinking. My first thought was that it had to be my brother. Maybe he had gotten up for a snack or a drink. He sometimes did that. I watched, waiting for it to move, to turn around and go back into the kitchen or to the bathroom. But it didn't move. Then, slowly, it raised its arm and waved. Not a big wave, just a small, slow movement of the hand, back and forth like someone saying hello from a distance. That was the moment I realized something was wrong. My brother never did things like that. He wouldn't stand in the living room and wave at me in the middle of the night. And he was only 12 at the time. He hated the dark and always turned on lights if he got up. The living room was still mostly dark. No lights were on. My heart started to pound. I sat completely still, frozen, unsure what to do. I thought about calling out, but my voice didn't come. I thought about getting up and walking toward it, but my legs didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the dark figure at the end of the hallway, watching it stand perfectly still again after that one slow wave. Then I slowly pulled the blanket over my head. I didn't know what else to do. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just knew I didn't want to see it anymore. I stayed like that for a long time, maybe 10, 15 minutes. Listening, waiting, my ears strained for any sound. Footsteps, breathing, a door opening. But there was nothing, just silence. Eventually, I worked up the courage to peek out. The hallway looked empty. The shape was gone. I stayed awake until the sun came up. I didn't get out of bed, didn't go into the living room, didn't check anything. I just lay there, heart still pounding in my chest, staring at the ceiling and waiting for the light to make me feel safe again. When morning came, I went into the living room, pretending to look casual. Nothing was out of place. The furniture was fine, the door was locked, the windows were closed. I checked on my brother. He was asleep in his bed. My mom was still in her room. Everything looked normal. Still, something didn't feel right. I didn't tell anyone that morning. Not right away. I just tried to brush it off like maybe I had dreamed it or imagined it or half saw something in the dark. I kept trying to find a logical reason. But all day it stuck with me. That shape, that slow wave, the feeling in my chest that I can still remember even now. Later that day, I did tell my mom. I said it quietly, not really expecting much. She listened, nodded a bit, and said not to worry about it, that it was probably nothing. I think she meant well. She probably thought I just had a weird dream or got scared of shadows. I didn't argue, but I knew it wasn't nothing. That evening we went out to eat. It was just the three of us. My mom was kind, made jokes, and tried to keep things light. I tried to enjoy it. I really did. But there was this strange heaviness in the air, like something hanging over the day that no one could see but me. The next morning, on my actual birthday, everything changed. We got the call sometime before noon. It was from my aunt. My godfather had passed away during the night. He was found in his apartment early in the morning by a neighbor who hadn't seen him come out to walk his dog like he usually did. Heart failure, they said. No signs, no warnings. Just gone. I remember sitting on the couch, the same couch I had looked toward 2 nights before. I felt cold, not just on my skin, but deep inside. My mom was on the phone, and I could hear the disbelief in her voice. She kept asking questions. My brother sat beside me, confused. He didn't really understand. I sat there, thinking about the shadow, the wave, the silence. It didn't feel like a dream anymore. My godfather had been one of the kindest people I knew. He wasn't blood family, but he had always been there. Birthday cards, little gifts, visits every few months. He didn't have a wife or kids of his own. I think he liked being a godfather. He took it seriously in his own way. I started thinking about the timing, the shape I saw in the living room, the moment it happened, the wave, and then him, gone just hours later. But I didn't say anything. Not again. I didn't bring it up to my mom anymore, didn't talk about it with my brother. It just felt too strange, too impossible to put into words that made sense. I didn't want to sound crazy, and I didn't want to turn my godfather's death into some kind of mystery. It felt wrong, so I kept it inside. A few weeks went by. We went to his funeral. It was quiet, simple, respectful. I stood there listening to people talk about his life. They said things about how he always smiled, always remembered people's birthdays. They said he was thoughtful, funny in his own dry way. They said he died peacefully, probably in his sleep. I stood there thinking about that wave again. After that, life went on. School, chores, the regular things. But something had shifted in me. I couldn't stop thinking about how easily we try to explain away the things we can't understand. I started noticing how often people ignore small, strange things because they don't want them to mean anything. And I kept wondering, why had I woken up that night at that exact moment? Why had I walked to the door and seen the living room? Why had that shadow waved at me like it was saying goodbye? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Was it grief before the grief even came? I tried to be logical. I told myself maybe I had seen a coat rack or a shadow from a passing car, or maybe I had dreamed it after all. I looked up sleep paralysis, hallucinations, night terrors. I read articles, but none of it matched what I felt. That moment hadn't been vague or confused. It had been clear, real. It had weight to it, but I still never saw anything like it again. Now, 2 years later, I still think about it sometimes. It doesn't scare me like it did, but it stays with me. Not like a horror movie kind of fear, but something quieter, a deep kind of unease. The kind that comes from knowing that some moments in life don't have answers and never will. That some things happen right on the edge of what we understand, and they leave a mark. Maybe what I saw really was just a trick of light. Maybe my brain made something out of nothing. But that wave, that quiet, slow wave from the darkness didn't feel like nothing. It felt like something real, even if I'll never know what. And even though it frightened me at the time, now, looking back, I don't feel scared when I remember it. I feel something else. Something more like sadness. Like it was someone saying goodbye in a way I wasn't supposed to understand. Like something ended that night, not just for him, but for me too. Some small part of childhood, of safety, fell away. And in its place came the knowledge that life doesn't always make sense, and sometimes it leaves you with questions that no one else can answer. I haven't told anyone this whole version. Not my mom, not my brother, not any friends. I just keep it here in my mind. But sometimes when I walk through the house at night, and the lights are low and the rooms are quiet, I still glance toward that living room doorway. And for just a second, I remember what it felt like to see that shadow in that wave. And I remind myself that even the things we can't explain still happen, whether we're ready or not. When I was about 21, my cousin was getting married in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The whole family was making a trip out of it, even people I hadn't seen in years. It was the kind of thing where second cousins and distant aunts came out of the woodwork just to be part of something social. I wasn't really excited, but it was one of those obligations that you couldn't really get out of. My cousin, Jen, was the bride, and even though we were never that close, we'd grown up around each other during holidays and reunions. I figured I'd go, show my face, have some food, smile through it, and then come home. That was the plan. The wedding was taking place in a small chapel just outside the main part of town, and a lot of the guests booked rooms at a nearby hotel that had some historical charm. It was one of those old places that tried to hold on to its 19th century feel. Creaky floorboards, floral wallpaper, brass doorknobs, high ceilings with wide molding. You could tell it had been remodeled over and over again to keep it functional, but they hadn't stripped away the character. Honestly, the place felt like it still breathed through its walls. I ended up sharing a room with my mom and my cousin Matt. Matt and I were close. We'd spent a lot of time together as kids, and even though we didn't talk often anymore, it was easy to fall back into that old rhythm of teasing each other and laughing about stupid stuff. The room we were given had 2 queen beds. My mom and I took one, and Matt had the other. There was no couch or cot, and we didn't feel like shelling out for another room, especially for just one night. We got in late that evening after the rehearsal dinner. It was the kind of dinner that drags on longer than necessary, because nobody wants to be the first one to say they're tired. We'd eaten a small banquet room in one of the newer hotels, with those overhead lights that make everything look slightly yellow. The food was okay: dry chicken, buttery rolls, watery green beans. By the time we got back to our room, I felt bloated and drained. Matt passed out almost instantly. He kicked off his shoes, collapsed face first on his bed, and didn't even bother to pull the blanket over himself. My mom got up to go brush her teeth, and I just sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through my phone for a while. I wasn't tired yet, but I knew I needed to be. I could hear the occasional footstep outside our door, people talking in the hallway, laughing, dragging luggage. Eventually, it quieted down, and the sounds faded to just the hum of the HVAC system and the faint creaking of the building settling. It took me longer than usual to fall asleep. Maybe it was the heavy meal or the way the room seemed to hold on to the heat. The air conditioning barely made a dent, and I kept feeling a weird draft coming from somewhere near the window. We were on the second floor, and I could see the outline of the trees outside when I turned the lights off. I remember shifting around a lot, trying to find a cool part of the blanket, adjusting the pillow, doing that thing where you stare at the ceiling until your thoughts become a kind of background noise. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke up suddenly and had no idea why. I didn't bolt upright or anything dramatic like in the movies. I just opened my eyes and felt instantly alert. The digital clock on a nightstand read 3:11 a.m. The room was completely dark except for the faint green glow of the clock and a sliver of light coming in from the hallway under the door. At first, I didn't hear anything. The air felt heavier than before. My mom was asleep next to me, her breath slow and even but just loud enough to be noticeable. I thought maybe she was the one who woke me up. Maybe she rolled over or made a noise, but she was still snoring lightly, her hand resting near the edge of the bed. Then I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It came from somewhere near the middle of the room, maybe a bit closer to where Matt was sleeping. It was faint, but clear enough to understand. "Ma." Long, drawn out. Not hurried or panicked, just low and slow. It sounded like someone saying his name from a distance, but there was no echo. It wasn't distorted. It sounded like a real voice. I stayed completely still. I didn't even blink. At first, I thought it had to be Matt himself, maybe talking in his sleep. But the voice didn't sound like him. And then it happened again. "Ma." Same pitch, same drawn-out tone. It didn't sound angry or sad or excited. Just the name, stretched and repeated, like whoever it was didn't need a response. The third time I heard it, I felt my heart pound in my chest. My body was frozen. I didn't want to move or breathe too loud. I didn't look over at Matt's bed. I was scared of what I might see. Something felt wrong, but I didn't know what. And then, out of nowhere, I heard Matt speak. "What?" Just one word, half awake and confused, but loud enough to make me jump a little. His voice came from across the room, groggy and annoyed. I could tell by the way he said it, that he wasn't fully awake. He sounded like he was answering someone who had been bothering him. But after he said it, there was nothing. No reply. No more whispers. Just silence again. I waited. Matt didn't say anything else. My mom didn't stir. I was still lying there with the blanket pulled up to my chin, my ears straining for any sound, trying to hear anything that might make sense of what just happened. I didn't say a word. I didn't want to. I kept thinking maybe it was a dream. Maybe I had imagined the whisper. But Matt had responded to it. He heard it too. I lay awake like that for a long time, maybe an hour or more. I felt like if I closed my eyes again, something might happen. Something might move or speak again. But the room stayed still, except for my mom's steady breathing. I kept my eyes on the ceiling, then the clock, then back to the ceiling. At some point, the darkness got softer. The sky outside started to turn that dull gray-blue color it gets before sunrise. And I finally drifted off again, but only lightly. It wasn't real sleep. It was the kind of half-sleep where you're constantly aware of your surroundings, where your muscles never fully relax. The next thing I remember clearly was my mom screaming. Not a yelp, a full, sharp scream that shot me straight up in bed. It was just after 6 in the morning. The sun was barely up, and the room was filled with a weird mix of shadows and pale daylight. I turned toward her and saw her grabbing at the sheets like something had just touched her. Her eyes were wide and wild, and for a second I really thought she'd seen something in the room. But she started babbling about a dream she had. Something about a giant spider crawling on her chest. She said it felt so real that she woke up screaming. My chest was still tight from the night. That whisper hadn't left my mind, and now hearing her panic like that just brought it all back to the surface. Matt sat up too, rubbing his face, clearly still groggy. He looked at me, and then looked at my mom like he wasn't sure what was real and what wasn't. Then he asked, kind of quiet, "Why were you calling my name last night?" My mom looked confused. She said she hadn't. She said she was asleep the whole night, aside from the spider dream. She said she didn't remember anything else. Matt looked at me, and I just nodded. I told him I'd heard it too. 3 times. I told him I was awake the whole time, that I'd heard someone whisper his name, and that it wasn't my mom. He stared at me for a few seconds, then didn't say anything. He just got up and started packing his stuff. We didn't really talk much after that. None of us did. That morning, we checked out and headed to the chapel for the ceremony. I kept looking back at the hotel as we pulled away, just staring at the windows, wondering if something was still in that room. Not something supernatural. I didn't think that way, but something strange. Maybe another guest. Maybe someone in another room who said it loud enough to travel through the walls. Or maybe it was some kind of sleep-related thing, my mind trying to make sense of ambient noise while I was between sleep and wakefulness. But even now, years later, it still doesn't sit right with me. Because Matt heard it too. He was fully asleep, and that whisper was enough to wake him up. He wasn't dreaming. He answered out loud, and my mom was dead asleep, snoring right next to me. I'll never forget the sound of that voice, the way it dragged out his name like it was calling to him from far away, from some cold part of the room where no one was supposed to be. We never stayed there again. We never even talked about it after that weekend. The wedding went fine. Jen looked beautiful, Everyone cried at the vows, people danced, and took photos and laughed. But that night still stays with me. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. There was no explanation. No footsteps in the hall. No weird guests. No sleep talking. Just that voice, slow and soft and deliberate, calling out a name that wasn't mine. And then nothing. Just silence. College had always seemed like this weird halfway world to me, somewhere between childhood and actual adulthood. You were surrounded by new people who were supposed to be your peers, but you didn't really know anything about them. I went in expecting wild parties, late night debates, and maybe a few cringy mistakes along the way. I didn't expect to end up genuinely afraid for my life, but that's what happened. Our dorm was one of those old mid-century buildings with 3 floors, creaky pipes, and narrow cinderblock hallways that smelled like old carpet and microwaved ramen. I lived on the 2nd floor with 2 roommates. It was cramped and uncomfortable, but it was our space. We were loud, messy, and pretty much high most of the time for that first semester. We'd had just become our thing. We didn't do it constantly, but enough that it colored our afternoons and made long nights feel like they passed in fast forward. It was during one of those hazy late afternoons that I met him. I don't remember exactly what we were doing. Probably laughing over some dumb movie or blasting music too loud. But I remember the door was open and the 3 of us were in this thick fog of smoke and snacks and pointless conversation when he just walked in. At first I assumed he was a friend of one of my roommates. Maybe someone from a class or just another dude from our floor. But he wasn't. He lived on the floor above ours. He just walked in without knocking or saying anything, stood in the doorway for a few seconds, and then wandered in like he belonged there. He had this awkward half smile, like someone trying to mimic how a person looks when they're happy, and he didn't say much, just sat down and stared at the TV. He wasn't smiling at the screen or even looking at us, really, just sort of existing there in the middle of our room. There was something off about him. It wasn't obvious right away, but the longer he sat there, the more I noticed it. He didn't react when we laughed. He didn't ask to join the conversation. He didn't introduce himself. He just sat in our space like he'd wandered in from a different world. But he didn't seem dangerous. If anything, he seemed quiet. Weird, maybe even kind of sad. So we didn't kick him out. After that, he started showing up more often. I'd be walking back from class and see him hanging around the hallway like he was waiting for someone. He'd knock on our door, poke his head in, and ask what we were doing. We didn't exactly invite him, but it was hard to tell him no. And he always managed to make it inside. He was drawn to us. Or maybe it was just me. He latched on the most to me and 2 of my closest friends. We were the ones who smoked the most, hung out the most, and were probably the least confrontational. At first, it was just awkward having him around. His presence kind of killed the vibe. But after a few times getting high with him there, it started to get uncomfortable. He was unpredictable when he was stoned. He'd space out, then suddenly start laughing for no reason. Or he'd mutter to himself, completely unaware of us in the room. Once he pulled out a pocket knife and started scraping something off his shoe with this blank look on his face. None of us knew what to say, so we just watched. Eventually, I started making excuses to avoid him. If I saw him in the hall, I'd duck into someone else's room or pretend I was late for something. My friends did the same, but he didn't take the hint. He kept showing up, kept asking to hang out. Sometimes he'd stand outside our room, not knocking or saying anything, just waiting. It got to the point where I'd wait until the coast was clear before leaving for class. I'd even take the stairs on the opposite side of the building to avoid walking past his floor. When he finally figured out we were avoiding him, he didn't say anything to the others. Just me. I don't know what it was. Maybe I'd been too polite to him in the beginning, or maybe I reminded him of someone from his past. But something about me clearly pissed him off. I started noticing him glaring at me during meals in the cafeteria, or lingering near me in the library without actually saying anything. Once, I caught him standing by the vending machines outside our floor at 2 a.m. I hadn't heard him come in, but he was just there when I walked past to get water. Eyes wide open, staring. It all came to a head a few weeks later. I'd just gotten back from class, exhausted and sweating from the heat. Our room was a sauna. My roommates had this rule, where we kept the door open with a fan blowing out to draw air from the hallway. It made a difference, but it also meant anyone could just walk in. And he did. I walked in and froze. There he was sitting on my desk chair like he lived there, talking to my roommate and another friend from down the hall. Everyone looked stiff, like they didn't know how to tell him to leave. And there was that smile again, the same one he wore the first time he came in. Except this time, it didn't look like an awkward attempt at being friendly. It looked intentional, like he knew something we didn't. I didn't say anything, just stood by the door while he talked. He was telling some story about his childhood, how hard it had been, how people had always misunderstood him, how he'd been bullied, ignored, cast aside. His voice was flat, but his words were heavy, like he wanted us to feel sorry for him. Then he said it, out of nowhere. No lead in, no explanation. He said if he ever killed anyone, he'd make sure they suffered. He said he was a sadist and didn't believe in quick deaths. He said it like someone reading off a grocery list. Calm, cold, certain. No one said a word. I remember looking at my roommate. He looked back at me, then at our other friend. All of us exchanging glances like we were trying to figure out if this was some kind of twisted joke or if we were actually in danger. I don't remember how long he stayed after that. Could have been minutes. Could have been longer. But eventually, he left. We all sat there in silence for a while. Nobody even wanted to be the first to bring it up. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way he said it, the way he smiled, the way he looked right at me. Our door was open again, and I could see shadows moving in the hallway from my bed. Every sound made me tense. Every creak of the floor above felt like footsteps coming closer. I ended up staying awake until the sun came up. We reported him to the RA the next day, told him everything, how the guy walked into our room uninvited, how he followed me around, how he made threats. But nothing came of it. The RA just said he'd look into it and maybe schedule a mediation meeting if things escalated. What were we supposed to do with that? I started locking up my stuff and sleeping with a bat next to the bed. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't want to freak them out. But every night, I was waiting for him to come back, for something worse to happen. He didn't show up again for a while, but I knew he was still around. I'd hear him walking upstairs, dragging his feet in that slow, deliberate way. Sometimes I'd hear him pacing, like he was circling above my room. Then, all of a sudden, he was gone. It happened during finals. One day, he was there, eating alone in the dining hall, sitting silently in a corner lounge. Then the next, he wasn't. I didn't notice right away. It took a few days for me to realize I hadn't seen him. Nobody had. We asked around. Some people said they thought he dropped out. Others said he'd been transferred to a different dorm or kicked out quietly. But there were no announcements. No real answers. Part of me was relieved, but another part couldn't stop thinking about where he'd gone. He didn't seem like the kind of person who'd just walk away. He felt unfinished, like a fuse that never reached the bomb. I moved out at the end of the year. Got an apartment off campus with a locking front door, no shared hallways, no strange footsteps overhead. I stopped getting high for a while. Every time I did, my mind drifted back to him, his eyes, his smile, the way he watched me without blinking. Sometimes I still think about what he said that day, about how if he ever killed someone, he'd want to torture them first. I wonder if he meant it. I wonder if he ever actually did. But most of all, I wonder why he picked me. I never got an answer, and I never will. But I do know this, I never slept with the door open again. Not once. Not ever. I don't know if you'd call this creepy, but it's definitely the scariest thing I've ever lived through. I've never told it in full before, not the way it really happened, because honestly, it still gets my heart pounding when I think about it. It was back in 2004. I had been going to climbing gym regularly and had gotten to know a group of people there who were really into outdoor climbing, canyoneering, the works. They were all more experienced than I was, and at the time I was just starting to feel like I was part of that world, that I could hang with these guys. When someone mentioned a multi-day canyoneering trip out to Utah, I immediately said I was in. I didn't ask enough questions. I just wanted to belong. Rick, not his real name, was our appointed leader. He was the most experienced among us, and he had done that kind of trip many times before. He had all the gear, talked like he knew everything, acted like he'd studied the route carefully. The rest of us trusted him because, well, none of us really knew better. There were 8 of us, 5 guys, 3 women. I barely knew most of them beyond gym banter and the odd coffee stop after a climb. We were more like acquaintances with a shared hobby than real friends. But that was fine. I didn't sign up for bonding. I signed up for the thrill. We drove out, parked our cars at a dusty turnout that looked like nothing in the middle of nowhere, and started our approach on foot. It took 2 full days of hiking to reach the cave system entrance. During that hike, we stopped at a climber's cafe, one of those weird, half-wooden, half-trailer looking places that serve breakfast all day and have climbing stickers plastered all over the windows. That's where we met Joe. Older guy, probably mid-50s, wiry, sunburnt, wearing a patched-up wetsuit rolled down to his waist. He was alone, sitting outside, sipping lukewarm coffee out of a steel mug. We got to chatting because, as it turned out, he was heading to the same cave system. Same day, same route. It was kind of weird. Who does that kind of expedition alone? But he had gear with him, and he clearly knew what he was doing. He had this sort of calm, half-checked-out way of speaking that made him seem competent, but a little odd. Anyway, Rick said it'd be smart to team up. Joe agreed. I didn't think much of it at the time. An extra set of ropes and carabiners couldn't hurt. That's all I thought. After the 2-day approach, we camped out just above the entrance. It was late July, hot during the day, with stars so bright at night it felt like you could hear them. The rock was dry, cracked, hard as iron. Sky blue and not a single cloud. No rain, not even a breeze. I remember that because of what happened later. The next morning, we geared up. We had to wear wetsuits because cave water is brutally cold, always, even in summer. That's just how it is. No sun, no warmth ever. I had a proper winter-rated wetsuit that clung to me like a second skin. Some others did too. Some didn't. That morning, Joe looked uneasy. He mumbled something about having a bad feeling, but we all brushed it off. We joked about jinxing the trip and told him not to worry. Joe just shrugged and went back to adjusting his gear. Looking back, I think he already knew something we didn't. Not because of some sixth sense or supernatural warning, but because experience makes you read the world in ways others can't. But we didn't listen. We started our descent into the cave. At first, everything went smoothly. The entrance was narrow, with a rough drop that we rappelled into, landing on wet stone that smelled like iron and rot. The air turned instantly cold and stale. It was tight at first, single file crawling, then gradually opened up into a winding tunnel tall enough to stand in if you hunched a little. I was third from the rear, so I could always see someone ahead and behind me. We moved slowly, picking our footing, headlamps casting shaky beams of light against walls that shimmered with dampness. We moved deeper and deeper. 2, maybe 3 hours in, we were past the point of natural light. The darkness around us was so absolute that when I turned off my headlamp once, I couldn't even see my own hand pressed against my nose. That kind of darkness does something to you. It makes time lose meaning. It makes your own thoughts sound louder, harsher. We were maybe midway into the cave when we heard it, a low, deep rumble that vibrated through the rock. At first, I thought it was in my head like pressure shifting in my ears, but then others paused too. It sounded like a generator humming far away. Not rhythmic, but building like something was slowly coming alive. A cold wind hit us next, sudden and sharp, not just from the usual air pockets, but something stronger. That's when I saw Joe's headlamp bob up in the distance and then vanish into a blur. He was running, not jogging, not fast walking. He was sprinting through the narrow tunnel, screaming without words, just yelling as loud as he could. I didn't need to be told what was happening. The sound, the cold air, the vibration, it all clicked. Flash flood. Somewhere far above us, a freak rainstorm was dumping water onto the surface, and it was all funneling into this cave. The flood came like it had been waiting for us. Waiting. At first, just a trickle around our boots. Then, ankle deep in seconds. I ran or tried to. Ever try to sprint in a flooded tunnel wearing a wetsuit and carrying a heavy pack? It's like trying to run in a dream where your legs won't work. Water sloshed around us, rising by the second. Every 30 seconds, it seemed to gain another inch. It became shin deep, then knees, then thighs. Tracy, one of the girls, froze. She just froze. Mid-panic, mid-motion, she stopped and stood there screaming, blocking the narrow passage. She hadn't even put on her wetsuit properly. It was too big, flapping around her like a wet rag. Dave, her boyfriend, yanked at her, dragging her like a dead weight until she stumbled forward again. People were slipping, falling, scrambling. I remember the noise. Not just the water, but the panic. Screaming, cursing, gear clattering, bodies slamming against wet rock. And all the while, the water kept rising. Waist deep now. I genuinely thought I was going to die in that cave. We all did. We were strangers, barely more than gym buddies. And yet in that moment our lives were completely tied together. I didn't care who was who anymore. All I wanted was to move, to not be the last one, to not be trapped against a wall with water in my lungs. At some point, I felt the space open up ahead of me. I hadn't noticed the tunnel widening until I stumbled into a much larger chamber. There was standing water here, a vast pool, still, glassy, deeper than anything we had passed. I plunged into it because there was nowhere else to go. The cold was so intense it felt like knives on my skin, even through my wetsuit. I kicked as hard as I could toward the far end. Somewhere in the darkness, Joe was shouting again. He kept yelling, "Get to the crevice! Get to the crevice!" I didn't know what he meant until I saw him hauling himself into a narrow opening above the waterline. It looked just big enough for one person. There were more like it. Small, irregular crevices cut into the upper wall of the chamber, above the water. One by one, we scrambled into them. No room to stretch or lie down. Just enough space to cling to the stone, high and dry, and wait. And hope. We watched the water rise. And rise. It didn't stop. It went past the point where you could stand in it. Past the point where you could tread water. It rose above our heads. Then higher still. We huddled in our little holes, watching that black surface inch closer to us. I remember my breathing was loud in my ears. Everything else had gone quiet except for the occasional sob or a muttered curse. The fear then was different. It wasn't panic anymore. It was quiet, heavy dread. I had 1,000 thoughts racing in my head. How long could I stay here? What happens when the water reaches us? How long does it take to drown? Will it hurt? Will I struggle? Will I black out? Or will I feel it? I kept thinking about the headlines. 8 climbers perish in Utah cave. Maybe our families wouldn't even know where to find bodies. Maybe we'd never be found at all. I don't know how long we stayed like that. 10 minutes? Half an hour? Time didn't make sense down there. Then, just as suddenly as it came, the water stopped rising. First it slowed, then stilled, then began to sink. You could see the line it left on the walls. Inches below our hiding places. Just inches. When the water finally receded enough for us to move again, we climbed down into it. We were shaking, not from fear now, but from cold, from exhaustion. The chamber was still filled with water, but low enough now that we could swim across without the threat of drowning. Here's the part that really stuck with me, though. When we reached the exit from the chamber, when we tried to go back the way we came, Rick finally admitted that he didn't have the right gear to get us out. Either he'd packed wrong, or he forgot a component, or something else entirely. It doesn't matter. What matters is we were stuck. Except for Joe. Joe had the gear. Anchors, lines, carabiners, everything we needed to build a way out. He set it up calmly, methodically, while the rest of us stood there like frozen statues. I think that's when I realized just how close we had come. If Joe hadn't been with us, if we hadn't randomly run into him at that cafe, we wouldn't have made it out. I had been on the road for nearly a year. A bicycle tour across continents, borders, and everything in between. I had pedaled through the Amazon and Ecuador, felt the air thin in the mountains of Peru, crossed rivers, valleys, forests, and endless backcountry dirt roads. I'd cooked over fires, filtered water from streams, patched tires in the rain, and slept in 100 different corners of the world, alone. Some nights were peaceful, some nights were hard, but nothing compared to that last night in Arizona. That was the one night I still think about sometimes when I can't sleep, the one that doesn't fade like the others. It stayed sharp in my memory like a thorn buried in skin. It was late spring when I crossed back into the United States. My route curved through Texas, New Mexico, and finally Arizona. I was headed west toward home. I had about 2 days left on the trip. I could have made it to my endpoint in a day if I really pushed it, but I wasn't in a rush. After a year of constant movement, I didn't feel like rushing anything. I wanted to savor the last few miles. I wanted to breathe in the desert, let the wind dry the sweat on my skin, sleep under a few more stars. That night, I found a flat patch of land off a dusty dirt road, maybe 30 miles from the next town. The road was quiet, just sand, cactus, and scrub brush stretching out in every direction. The sun was already low when I stopped. There wasn't much around. A couple of Palo Verde trees bent over dry ground. Tall saguaro cacti stood scattered like silent guards. I liked it immediately. It felt open, clean, and safe. I leaned my bike against a rock and took off my helmet. My shirt was damp, crusted with salt. My shoulders and arms were brown from months of sun. I walked in circles for a while, scoping out the area, checking for broken glass, nests, animal burrows, anything that might signal trouble. Nothing. Just wind, dust, and the metallic hum of insects. I set up my tent on the most level spot I could find. The dirt was loose, and the wind kicked up small, dry whirlwinds of sand that dusted everything. I staked the corners down tight, double-checked the seams, and unfurled my sleeping pad. I hung my food in a mesh bag high in the arms of a nearby cactus, away from the tent. It wasn't a perfect system, but it worked well enough. I'd done this hundreds of times by now. After I finished setting up, I took out my little travel guitar. It was beat up and scratched from being strapped to the back of the bike for thousands of miles, but it still played. I sat on a rock and strummed for a while as the sun dipped below the horizon. Simple chords, half-remembered songs, sometimes nothing at all, just sound. Music helped calm my nerves after long days. Sometimes, in the far reaches of Peru or Bolivia, it reminded me that I was still connected to something familiar, even when I hadn't spoken to anyone for days. That night, I didn't feel afraid. I wasn't in some unknown jungle or a remote mountain pass. I was in Arizona, my home state. I knew these deserts. I had grown up around this kind of landscape. It was dry, harsh, but not mysterious to me. I didn't expect any trouble. When the sky went dark, I crawled into the tent and zipped it up. The air was cool, the wind softer now. I lay down on my back and stared up through the mesh of the tent roof. The stars were scattered like salt across black glass. I pulled the sleeping bag up to my chest and let my mind drift. That's when I first heard it. A light, quick rustling in the dirt close to the tent. It was soft but distinct, like tiny paws pattering across the ground, stopping, then starting again. It circled part of the tent, stopped, then moved again. I froze. Not in fear exactly, just alertness. Years of camping had taught me to notice every sound. I'd dealt with all sorts of critters, raccoons, foxes, mice. This sounded like something small. Maybe a ringtail, maybe a jackrabbit. Could have been anything, really. It kept coming closer, then pausing, like it was deciding whether or not to come right up to the tent. I waited a few minutes, then slowly unzipped the flap and looked out. Nothing. Whatever it was, it scurried away at the first sound. I waited another few minutes, then lay back down. But it came back. Same pattern, approach, pause, scurry. I sat up again and listened. I didn't feel afraid. I was mostly curious. Whatever it was didn't seem dangerous. Just persistent. I wanted to get a good look at it. So I came up with a plan. I would leave the flap of the tent open and sit up inside with my headlamp off, finger on the button. I pointed the lamp toward the area where I'd heard the sounds, just past the tent edge in the brush. I would wait quietly, totally still, and then hit the light when it got close. I sat there for 10 minutes, maybe longer, breathing slow, listening to the wind. I started to wonder if the thing had left for good. Then I heard it, faint, deliberate movement in the dirt. Coming closer. This time it didn't pause. The sound came straight toward me, maybe 5 or 6 feet from the tent. I clicked on the light. 2 eyes reflected back at me. Wide, low to the ground. They blinked once, slowly, but didn't move. The light lit up the dust in the air, the tips of the cactus needles behind it, and the small patch of dry grass where it stood. I couldn't make out its body fully, just the shape of the eyes, the height, and the stillness. It wasn't a coyote, not tall enough, not a rabbit either. Probably a ringtail or something similar. I held the light steady and watched. That's when I felt it. A weird sense. Not a fear yet, but a shift. Like I wasn't looking at one thing anymore. I slowly turned the beam of the light to the left across the cactus arm, and two more eyes reflected back at me. I blinked, confused. That couldn't be right. I turned the light back to the center, still there. Then right, two more eyes. This time, slightly taller. I could see the faint outline of a head, ears maybe, catching the light. I moved the beam farther to the right, past the back edge of my tent, and another pair of eyes lit up. Then another. I leaned out the open flap and aimed the light directly behind me. Two more. Then to the side, two more. A full circle. There were at least 8 sets of eyes. Maybe more. All at varying distances, all standing still, all looking toward the tent. That's when the fear came. A slow, cold realization hit me in the chest. I was surrounded, not by people, not by anything clearly dangerous yet, but something had organized itself around me in a circle. That wasn't normal behavior for any animal I'd encountered. I ran through every possibility in my head. Coyotes didn't circle people. Javelinas could be aggressive, but weren't that silent. Bobcats didn't move in groups. Mountain lions didn't hang around once discovered. The wind had stopped entirely. Everything was still. I couldn't hear any breathing, any growling, no warning sounds. Just the wind in my ears and the rustle of blood in my own head. I pulled the flap of the tent shut quietly, sat back, and grabbed the only thing I could think of that made noise, my guitar. It felt stupid at first, but I needed to break the silence. I needed to make it clear I was awake, alive, human. I strummed the strings hard. The sound echoed in the desert air, thin but loud. I strummed again. Chords didn't matter, just volume. I strummed harder, again and again, anything to keep the sound going. I kept the headlamp on, flashing it around every few minutes to see if the eyes were still there. They were. Sometimes 1 or 2 sets would disappear, then return again from another angle. I didn't sleep. I didn't lie down. I sat upright, back against the tent wall, gripping the guitar and watching. Every time I heard movement, I played more. I sang sometimes, not songs really, just notes, sounds, whatever came to mind. The desert stayed dark for a long time. Hours passed. My fingers started to cramp from the tension, from gripping the guitar neck too tight. My eyes were dry from staring so long into the night. At some point, I heard distant yipping, maybe coyotes, maybe something else. It didn't sound close. I didn't relax. By the time the sky began to lighten, my limbs were stiff and my throat was dry. The eastern horizon turned pale blue, then pink. I hadn't seen any eyes for nearly an hour. As the first direct sunlight touched the ground, I unzipped the tent slowly and looked out. There was nothing. No tracks I could see. No fur, no feathers, no signs of anything at all. The food bag was untouched. The area around the tent was just dry dirt, small rocks, and a few flattened patches where something might have stood, but nothing clear. I packed up fast, folded the tent with shaky hands, shoved the sleeping bag into the compression sack without rolling it. I didn't eat. I didn't strum the guitar. I loaded everything on a bike and rode away as soon as the sun was high enough to warm the air. The road felt strange under my tires, like I was pedaling through a dream. My legs moved without thinking, every part of me still half in that night. I never figured out what surrounded me that night. Could have been coyotes, could have been a pack of strays, could have been something totally mundane. But I'd camped for months in wild places, and nothing had ever done. I was born and raised in Kansas City, Missouri. I'd lived in the city most of my life, only leaving for short trips or the occasional family visit. This happened years ago, but I still think about it now and then. It wasn't the kind of story you'd see in a movie or hear in some wild ghost podcast. There were no monsters or shadows or whispers in the dark. Nothing like that. But it felt real. It was real, at least to me, and it shook me up more than I like to admit. I was on my way to visit family in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's not a bad drive. Around 4 hours if the roads are clear and traffic doesn't get in the way. I'd made that drive plenty of times before, usually without issue. But that day was different. I'd been up late the night before working on something for a friend, helping him fix his car in his garage. I figured I'd get a good night's sleep afterward, but I didn't. I got home, laid down around midnight, and tossed and turned most of the night. I might have gotten 3 hours of sleep, maybe less. Still, I got up early like I planned, packed my bag, and hit the road. I stopped for gas just outside the city limits, grabbed a bottle of water and a granola bar, and kept going. The sky was a dull gray that morning, the kind of sky that looked like it might rain, but never quite did. Just a heavy blanket of clouds hanging low and pressing down. The wind was steady, not strong, but enough to nudge the car every now and then as I drove south. I passed signs for Joplin, then Veneta, and then things started to blur. The interstate can be like that, just miles and miles of road, billboards, fields, trees, and sky. After a while, it all starts to look the same. I've been on the road a little over 2 hours when I felt it hit me. That kind of tired that comes out of nowhere. Not the usual road trip drowsiness, either. This was something heavier, more sudden. My head started nodding forward. My eyes blinked slower and slower. I shook it off a few times, rolled down the window to let in some cold air, cranked up the music. It helped for a little bit, but not much. Then I realized something. I didn't even remember the last 5 or 10 miles. That stretch of road gone. I looked around and couldn't recall passing any landmarks. That's when I knew I had to stop. I was still too far from the next major town, and the exits around me were just empty turnoffs with gravel roads and maybe a gas station if I was lucky. So I pulled off on the shoulder of the highway, well past the white line onto the grass. There was nothing around me. No buildings, no overpasses, just an empty stretch of interstate and flat land on either side. A few trees in the distance, barbed wire fence lining the edge of the field. Not a single car behind or in front of me as far as I could see. Just silence and sky and a low hum in my ears from the wind. I turned the car off, but left the keys in the ignition, just in case. I reclined the driver's seat and told myself I'd only rest for a few minutes, just long enough to stop the spinning in my head. I closed my eyes and felt that strange, heavy tiredness pull me under almost immediately. It wasn't like falling asleep at night in your bed. It felt more like sinking underwater. And then it happened. I don't know how much time passed. I didn't look at the clock before I closed my eyes. But I remember coming all at once. Not gradually, not the way you usually wake up. I bolted upright, heart racing, eyes wide open. The world outside the car was chaos. There were people, dozens of them, circling the car. Maybe 20, maybe more. Men, women, some looked young, others old. They were banging on the windows with their fists, their palms, slapping and pounding and pushing all over the glass. I could feel the car rocking from the force of it. They weren't saying anything I could understand. It was just screaming, loud, panicked, angry screaming. Not a word stood out. It was all noise and confusion, like a crowd at a riot or a protest. My brain couldn't catch up to what I was seeing. I remember thinking I must have stopped too close to someone's property, or maybe some kind of protest was happening nearby, and I'd parked in the wrong place. But it didn't make sense. Where had they come from? There was no town nearby, no buildings, no cars parked on the shoulder with me. Just open highway and flat land in every direction. They were yelling at me to get out, to move, to leave. I couldn't understand how I knew that. They weren't speaking in full sentences, but that's what it felt like. Their hands pounded harder and harder on the glass, like they were trying to break it, trying to pull me out of the car. And then I woke up, just like that. I was still alone in the car. No one around. No noise except the wind and the sound of a semi passing in the far lane. My chest was soaked with sweat like I'd been running. My heart was still racing, and I looked around, half expecting to still see them. But there was nothing, just the empty road. The car was exactly as I'd left it. Keys still in the ignition. Doors locked. Nothing touched. My seat was still reclined. I sat there for a long minute, trying to understand what had just happened. I hadn't felt like I'd been asleep, not really. It was like a flash of something. A dream, but not a normal one. It was more real than any dream I'd ever had before. The pressure of their fists on the glass. The sound of their voices. The way the car had rocked back and forth. And the strangest thing, the smell. I still remember it. Sweat and something metallic. It had followed me out of the dream, like it had soaked into my clothes. I rolled down the windows to get fresh air and sat up straight, trying to shake it off. The back of my shirt stuck to the seat. I started the car and pulled back onto the highway. I didn't think twice about it. I just drove. My tiredness was completely gone. I was wide awake. My hands gripped the wheel tight, and every time I passed another exit, I checked to see if there were cars or buildings, just to ground myself. I made it to Tulsa without stopping again. When I got to my family's place, I went straight to the bathroom, splashed water on my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes looked hollow, like I hadn't slept in days. I told myself it was just a dream, just my brain playing tricks on me from lack of sleep. But here's the part that gets me, even now. I checked the news later that night. Just curiosity. I wanted to know if anything strange had happened near the stretch of road where I stopped. I didn't find anything about a protest or any group gatherings. But there was one short story buried deep in the local section of an Oklahoma newspaper. There had been a fatal crash earlier that day. A semi had drifted off the road and slammed into a stalled vehicle. It had happened about 10 miles south of where I had stopped. The article said they believed the driver of the car had fallen asleep at the wheel, pulled off to the side of the highway, and never woke up. The time of the crash? Roughly 30 minutes after I would have still been asleep if I hadn't woken up. I don't know what made me dream what I did. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't think spirits were warning me or anything like that. But something in my brain or my body knew I shouldn't be there. It told me in the loudest way possible. And I listened. I've never had a dream like that again. In fact, I barely remember any dreams I've had since. But that one, I remember it like it really happened. Every single detail. The faces, the noise, the pounding on the glass. The sense of panic and urgency. Like they were trying to save me from something. Or maybe just push me out of harm's way. I've never pulled over on the side of a highway again. Doesn't matter how tired I am. I find a gas station, a rest stop, even a wide turnout. Anything but the shoulder. Sometimes I wonder if someone else has had a dream like that. Maybe the people I saw weren't just in my head. Maybe they were others like me. People who had pulled over once and never made it home. People who wish someone had pounded on their windows. I don't know, and I don't want to find out. All I know is I woke up, and I drove away, and I'm still here. That's enough for me. Five years ago, I was sitting up in bed reading a novel I don't even remember the name of now. It was late, probably around 11:30, and I'd turned on my small bedside lamp, the kind with a warm yellow light that barely spread past the edge of the mattress. The rest of the room was in shadow. The hallway beyond my open door was dark too, just barely touched by the lights spilling out from my room. The house was quiet, and the only sound was the occasional turning of the page and the muffled hum of the television from the living room. My boyfriend was out there, stretched across the old couch, half watching a show we'd already seen 100 times. We didn't have any visitors that night, no friends over, no one staying with us. Just a normal, slow evening. I remember the way the paper in the book fell under my thumb, and the exact place where the page curled slightly from how I held it. That's when I saw someone walk past my bedroom door. He didn't run, didn't linger. He just walked slowly from left to right. I only caught the shape for a moment, but I could see him well enough to know it was a man. Tall, thin, older. He moved in that casual, steady way that people walk when they know exactly where they're going. Not hurried, not trying to be quiet, like he belonged in the house. I froze. My first reaction wasn't fear exactly. It was confusion. I didn't move at first, didn't even put the book down. My eyes were glued to the hallway. The air in the room felt heavier. Somehow, the silence turned thick. I waited to hear footsteps, a door creaking open, anything. But there was nothing. After a few seconds, I set the book down and got up, walking to the door and looking out into the hall. It was empty. All the doors were open. The bathroom light was off. The kitchen was dark. Nothing was out of place. I called out to my boyfriend, and I remember how strange my voice sounded, like I was trying too hard to sound casual. He answered right away from the couch. He hadn't moved. He hadn't heard anything. He hadn't seen anyone. He was exactly where he'd been for hours. I checked every room, closets, the laundry area, even under the beds, which felt ridiculous. but there was nothing. No sign anyone had been in the house. Every window was locked. Front door too. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept trying to tell myself I imagined it, that maybe it was the way the light hit the hallway or some reflection or shadow. But it hadn't looked like a shadow. It had looked like a person. A month went by. I stopped thinking about it after a while. I got caught up in work, errands, just life. We moved our furniture around a little, bought new sheets, did normal things. But then one night, I woke up at around 3 in the morning. I didn't know why. There hadn't been a sound, no dreams, nothing I could remember that startled me awake. I just opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling, unsure what had broken my sleep. I was laying on my back, arms outside the blanket, and I remember feeling cold air on my skin. I turned my head slightly, just trying to readjust my pillow, and that's when I saw him again. He was standing at the foot of the bed. Same man. Tall, thin, old. He was wearing a jacket, dark, heavy-looking. His face was pale in the dim light, his features hard to make out, but I could feel that it was him. I blinked. Once. Twice. He didn't move. Didn't say anything. Just stood there, staring. I remember feeling like I was locked inside my body. Not paralyzed, just stunned. Frozen in the moment. I reached over slowly and turned on the lamp beside me. The second the light flicked on, he was gone. No noise. No movement. Just gone. I sat there for a long time. I didn't even want to get up to check the house. I just sat in bed, listening to the silence, trying to slow my breathing. I don't think I slept for the rest of the night. Over the next few weeks, I told myself it was a sleep hallucination. I read about them. People sometimes see things when they wake up, especially if they're under a lot of stress or if their brain hasn't fully transitioned out of dreaming. I clung to that explanation. I had to. It made it easier to fall asleep at night. I didn't tell anyone else about it. Then last month, I was staying with a friend in Oregon, thousands of miles from where I lived at the time. I'd gone to visit her for a week just to get away. It was supposed to be relaxing. She had a guest room, a clean and quiet little space at the end of the hall. Nothing about it felt strange or off. It was one of those tidy, well-lit rooms with folded towels at the foot of the bed and little decorative things on the nightstand. I felt safe there. I didn't even think about what had happened back home. But one night, I woke up again. Same kind of thing, dead quiet, pitch dark, middle of the night. I didn't know what time it was, and I didn't care. I just remember opening my eyes and instantly knowing something was wrong. It was the same sensation from before. That weird heaviness in the air, like the whole room was holding its breath. He was at the foot of the bed again. Tall, thin, old, same jacket, same stillness. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching me. The moonlight coming in through the window barely lit the outline of his shape, but it was enough. I knew it wasn't a dream. I knew it wasn't some part of the room or a trick of the eye. I'd seen him before, and now he was here, again, in a completely different state, a different house, a different bed. I lay there staring for a few seconds. I didn't move. Then I slowly laid my head back down, hoping that if I stopped looking, he'd be gone. I waited maybe 5 or 10 seconds, then peeked up again. He wasn't there. This time I didn't feel scared exactly. Just numb, tired in a deep way, like every muscle in my body didn't want to deal with it anymore. I didn't tell my friend. I didn't even write it down. I just went about the rest of my trip pretending it hadn't happened. But when I got home, something in me changed. I started thinking about all the little pieces, the timeline, where I was, what I'd been doing. It made me start digging into something I didn't really want to think about. I went back and looked at my calendar, my notes, even old photos. Anything I had from the last 5 years. And I started remembering smaller details that hadn't seemed important before. Like how the first time I saw him, I'd been reading about a historical murder case in the book. A true crime novel. The victim had been killed by a man who stalked his targets and watched them sleep. I'd completely forgotten that was what I'd been reading. The second time, the night he showed up in my room a month later, I'd fallen asleep watching a documentary about break-ins. There was a segment about a man who used to hide in people's houses without them knowing. He'd sleep in their attics, their basements. One woman lived with him for weeks before realizing someone else was there. I hadn't thought of the connection until I went back through my watch history. And last month, when I saw him in Oregon, my friend and I had been talking earlier that day about unsolved disappearances. Not serious talk, just casual, half-joking speculation about creepy stories from the internet. But I'd looked up a few things later that night before bed. One of them was about a tall, older man who was suspected of stalking women across state lines. It was like I planted seeds in my own head without realizing it. Still, it didn't explain everything. So I did something I hadn't done before. I looked up police records from my area, old arrest logs, public databases. I searched for crimes involving older men, assaults, stalking, burglaries. It took hours, but I eventually found something. Back in the late 90s, there had been a man arrested a few blocks away from where I lived. He was tall, thin, fit the same general description. He'd been charged with breaking and entering, trespassing, and unlawful surveillance. Apparently, he had a history of watching people in their homes. Not just watching, he would let himself in, walk through, stand at the foot of their beds. He didn't hurt anyone physically, but he left people shaken, violated, terrified. He was institutionalized for a while, but he'd been released over a decade ago. No one had heard anything about him since. What scared me the most wasn't the similarity between his description and the man I'd seen. It was the fact that the addresses from his known activities lined up almost exactly with where I'd lived at the time. Same block, same street, same pattern. And that was when I realized something I hadn't let myself think until then. Maybe I hadn't imagined him. Maybe it hadn't been a hallucination or some leftover image from a scary story. Maybe I'd seen a real person. And maybe he'd seen me too. The thought made me sick. Not in a dramatic way. Just this slow, cold unease that sat in the back of my throat for days. I kept trying to remember if I'd ever seen signs of someone being inside the house. A door unlocked that shouldn't have been. An item moved. A drawer open. But there was nothing. He'd left no trace. Just those moments burned into my memory. I ended up calling a security company. Got cameras installed. Motion sensors. Deadbolts. It wasn't about being scared anymore. It was about being prepared. I couldn't shake the thought that if someone really had been watching me, then they might do it again. Not because of ghosts or curses or supernatural reasons. Just because sometimes people do awful things for no reason at all. They pick someone and fixate. They keep coming back, and they don't always get caught. Since then, I haven't seen him again. It's been a month. Every night, I check the cameras. Every day, I double-check the doors. Sometimes I feel like I'm overreacting. Other times, I feel like I'm not being careful enough. I grew up in a small town on the prairie. We had long, flat summers that seemed to bake the dirt roads and endless fields until the heat shimmered above the ground, and winters that buried everything in silence and snow. The late 90s were a strange time there. Nothing moved fast, and everybody knew everyone else. There wasn't a lot of crime, and most of what had happened came down to boredom or alcohol. But that summer, right between middle school and high school, everything fell off. I didn't know it yet, but it was going to mark the beginning of the end of the part of my life that felt simple and safe. It started with the fires. At first, people thought they were accidents. The first one burned down an abandoned grain elevator on the edge of town. I remember riding my bike with some friends to the highway overpass just to watch the flames from a distance. We didn't think much of it. Not then. Fire trucks rolled out, sirens screaming, and by morning it was just a smoldering pile of ash and metal. The old man who owned the elevator had died a few years back, and no one had done anything with the property. People figured maybe some kids lit it up for fun. Then another one started, this time out near the dry storage sheds by the railway. Then another at a rundown barn outside of town. It became clear after the third or fourth that it wasn't just coincidence. Someone was doing this on purpose. The town didn't have many firefighters. We had a volunteer department with a small building near the center of town. The trucks weren't fancy, and the men weren't young. Most of them were farmers or mechanics or retirees who answered the call when it came in. One of them was Tom Rourke. Everyone called him Old Tom, even though he was only in his mid-60s. He'd been fighting fires since the late 60s. He had that hard jaw and dry voice you only got after decades of breathing smoke and working around diesel engines. He wasn't warm, exactly, but people respected him. He had a reputation for showing up fast and doing what needed to be done. Tom lived alone in a small white house near the edge of town. His wife had passed away in the early 90s, and his only son had moved out west for work. He had a couple of old hunting dogs, and he mostly kept to himself when he wasn't on duty. Despite his age, he still insisted on taking calls, especially when the younger guys couldn't make it. That summer, he was on nearly every call. There were so many fires popping up, sometimes two in the same week, and the other volunteers couldn't always break away from their farms or jobs. Tom would throw on his gear, grab the keys to one of the trucks, and head out alone. One evening in August, another fire broke out. It was on an old property south of town that had been empty for years. People said Tom went out on his own again. No one really thought twice about it. That's how things went. But this time, he didn't come back. At first, they thought maybe he'd had a heart attack or gotten disoriented in the smoke. A search party went out that night. They found a truck parked on a gravel road just off the property. The fire was out, mostly burned itself down. But Tom was nowhere. They checked the area, combed through the woods, drained a nearby slough. Nothing. It made the paper, sure, but most people assumed they'd find him eventually. Maybe he wandered into the wrong field and collapsed. Or maybe he got lost. It didn't make sense, but people didn't want to think of darker reasons. Weeks passed, then months. Summer turned to fall, then the snows came. People stopped talking about Tom. He became one of those sad stories that hang in the air of small towns, brought up now and then, but mostly left alone. The fire stopped too. That was the strangest part. After Tom disappeared, there weren't any more arsons. Not a single one. As if whoever was behind them had gotten what they wanted. Then came February. The snow had fallen heavy that year, so deep in some places that fences vanished and ditches turned into smooth, white plains. My friend Tyler lived on a big acreage a few miles outside town. His family raised cattle and boarded horses. We've been friends since grade school. He was the kind of kid who always had a tool in his pocket and a scar somewhere on his face. Always outside, always working on something. That day, he'd taken his snowmobile out behind their property. There were big open fields back there, some used for grazing in the summer, others just wild. The snow was thick and soft, and he said he was trying to carve a few jumps into a drift. But then he hit something, not hard, but enough to stop the track. When he got off to check, he found a strip of cloth stuck in the treads. He thought it was just a rag or something buried in the snow. But when he pulled it free, he realized it was thick canvas, like the kind on fire jackets. He turned around, followed his own trail back a few yards, and there he found it. Tom Rourke's body was lying half covered in snow. The cold had preserved it, but not perfectly. There was frost on his face and hands. The jacket was open, and you could see the dark stain across his chest. Later, we'd find out it was a shotgun blast. The buckshot had torn through him at close range. Tyler ran back to the house. His dad called the police, and then Tyler went back out. He didn't want someone else to stumble on the body. Maybe one of their neighbor's kids, or a stray dog. He told me later he just sat there next to Tom's body in the snow for over an hour, waiting for the authorities to come. The investigation that followed was quiet, but people were talking. Word got around that Tom hadn't died fighting a fire at all. He'd been murdered, shot in the chest. The killer had dragged his body from wherever it happened and dumped it out in that field, deep enough that no one would think to look. The fires, it turned out, had been set on purpose to lure Tom out. The police found evidence in one of the abandoned properties. Gasoline cans, maps, even pieces of burned clothing. Eventually, they arrested someone. He was a man who lived in a rundown trailer out on the county line. He had a record, petty theft, breaking and entering. Some said he'd been off since his teen years. There were rumors he'd been in and out of institutions. People said he'd had a grudge against Tom, though no one really knew why. Maybe Tom had pulled him out of a burning building once, and he blamed him for scars. Maybe Tom had arrested him years ago during one of the old volunteer sheriff rotations. Whatever the reason, he'd wanted Tom dead. The fires were bait. He got what he wanted. Tyler was never the same after that. Not in a big, obvious way. He still hung out with us, still played hockey on the pond, still showed up to school. But there was something in his eyes that changed. He was quieter. He'd drift off in the middle of conversation. He started carrying a pocket knife all the time, even in class. One time, he told me that when he first saw the body, he didn't know what it was. That his brain wouldn't let him understand what he was looking at. It was only when he saw the badge on the chest and the boots that had all clicked. Years later, I asked him about it again, and he just shrugged. He said, "You can't really unsee something like that." And I believed him. Tom's funeral was held in the town hall. The fire department showed up in full dress. There were men there from neighboring towns, even from the city 2 hours away. They carried his coffin in silence. People said kind words. A plaque went up in the fire hall with his name and the date. But the fires and the way he died hung over the town for a long time. We all grew up. Some of us moved away, some stayed. The field where Tyler found the body was eventually fenced off, and cattle went back to grazing there. Snow still covers it every winter, smooth and white, like nothing ever happened. But every time I drive past it, I think about that summer. I think about the smoke curling up from distant fields, the way the sun beat down on cracked dirt, the wail of sirens cutting through quiet afternoons. I think about Tom Rourke walking into one more fire alone, not knowing someone was waiting for him with a gun. And I think about Tyler sitting in the snow with that body, keeping watch in the cold. That's the kind of thing that stays with you, whether you want it to or not. I still remember the day I met her. It was late summer, one of those strange mornings where the air was warm, but the wind still carried a touch of coolness from the night. I'd arrived at the clinic just before 7 a.m., like always. The sun was just beginning to rise behind the backwoods, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I was tired as usual, and my coffee hadn't kicked in yet. It was shaping up to be a regular shift, checkups, a few surgeries, a dental cleaning or two. At that point, nothing seemed unusual. Nothing hinted at what was coming. I was halfway through cleaning the kennels when the receptionist buzzed back to say we had a walk-in emergency. A couple had brought in their elderly shepherd. She couldn't stand up, they said. They were worried it might be her hips, maybe arthritis or something neurological. I slipped off my gloves and walked up front to meet them. The shepherd was lying in the back of their SUV on a folded-up blanket, panting, her eyes dull and distant. I could smell something even before I got close, sickly sweet, almost metallic, and foul in a way I couldn't quite place yet. It was a stench that settled deep in your throat. She was a big girl, probably over 80 pounds. Her coat was thick and tangled, that coarse shepherd fur that turns into a matted jungle if left too long. Her eyes barely moved when I spoke her name off the intake sheet. She just breathed, short, shallow pants, and made no effort to lift her head or shift her weight. We had to carry her in on a stretcher. As we moved her, the smell got worse. A wave of heat and rot drifted off her as we settled her onto the exam table. I peeled back some of the matted fur on her hindquarters, and that's when I saw the first few maggots, tiny, white, wriggling bodies buried just under the surface of her skin, squirming in and out of tiny holes that looked more like punctures than wounds. My stomach clenched. I've seen a lot in this job. Open fractures, eviscerations, tumors the size of basketballs, animals torn apart by cars or larger predators. But this was different. This was quiet, slow horror. This was something that had crept in and made itself at home inside her. The owner said she'd had diarrhea. They'd hosed her off and let her rest in the sun, thinking she was just tired. I nodded, though I wasn't really listening anymore. I was focused on what I was seeing and smelling. I got the doctor, and we sedated her right away. It wasn't hard. She didn't have the energy to fight it. I clipped her belly fur first. The clippers clogged almost immediately. Thick mats, packed with filth and wet fur, bogged them down. I cleaned them, tried again, pushed through. That's when the full scope of it revealed itself. Underneath the tangled mass of fur and feces, her skin was raw. Not just irritated, but weeping and broken open. Maggots poured out of her. Thousands of them. They swarmed the clippers, oozing out of folds and wounds and pockets of necrotic tissue I hadn't even seen yet. They were under her tail, packed in her vulva, writhing in her inner thighs, and chewing through the soft, tender skin under her belly. They were white and plump and moving as one, like a living, breathing colony. The smell was unbearable. Rot and infection and decay, mixed with the chemical stink of clipper oil and alcohol wipes. I kept going. We had to get her clean. I clipped inch after inch of fur, working slowly, methodically, while one of the techs stood ready with warm saline and chlorhexidine to rinse away the masses of bugs. The worst part wasn't the maggots themselves, it was the way the skin peeled back with them. Like they'd already eaten through so many layers that the surface was just a thin sheet waiting to lift away. Her vaginal opening was nearly obscured by layers of necrosis and larvae. We had to flush inside it over and over, pulling out gobs of the creatures and rinsing until the tissue underneath looked something close to clean. No one spoke while we worked. There was nothing to say. We all knew this wasn't just a dirty dog or a careless owner. This was neglect. Not intentional, maybe, but neglect all the same. The couple had meant well. They thought they were caring for her. But what they had missed, what had been festering right under their noses, had almost killed her. We worked on her for over 2 hours. I lost track of how many rinse buckets we went through, how many times we had to pause to unclog the drains in the floor. Maggots crawled into corners, under the counter, into the folds of the towels we used to dry her. One of them got under my glove. I felt it squirm against my wrist before I could flick it off. I gagged but kept going. Once she was rinsed and clipped and cleaned, we started her on 4 fluids and antibiotics. Her white blood cell count was through the roof. Her temperature was low, and her heart rate was weak. We gave her pain meds, kept her wrapped in warm blankets, and monitored her overnight. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the folds of her skin opening like rotten fruit, white bodies moving inside like worms in meat. I smelled the infection even when I was home. It clung to my clothes, to my hair, to my skin. I threw out my scrubs and showered twice, but it didn't matter. It was in my mind, not on my body. She made it through the night. That was the first good sign. By the second day, she lifted her head. By the third, she wagged her tail. The wounds were still horrific, but clean now. The maggots were gone. Her appetite came back, and we were able to get her on her feet with a little help. It was like watching something come back from the dead. We kept her for a full week. Every day, I cleaned her wounds, flushed out the pockets of pus, and checked for signs of new infestation. But there were none. The damage had been caught just in time. She was tough, tougher than most humans I know. When the owners came to take her home, they looked stunned by the change. She stood on her own, tail wagging, coat trimmed short and clean. Her skin was pink where it had once been black with rot. They thanked us. I want to say more, but I didn't. I just watched them lift her into the car and drive away. That was a few years ago now. I've seen worse since. Animals hit by trains, puppies used as bait dogs, cats left to die in dumpsters. But that shepherd stuck with me in a way the others didn't. Maybe it was the quietness of her suffering, the way she had just laid there, breathing, while her body became food for something else. She hadn't cried. She hadn't growled or snapped. She had just endured. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if they'd waited one more day, if the maggots had reached her organs, or if infection had spread through her bloodstream. She would have died slowly, in pain, likely septic, maybe even paralyzed by the toxins in her blood. She would have died alone, confused, eaten alive. But she didn't. She lived. She healed. The last I heard, she'd gone back to sleeping on her favorite blanket in the sun, this time with clean fur and a healed body. Her skin had scarred, but the infection was gone. She lived out the rest of her days in peace. People always assume the worst stories involve blood and violence, but the truth is, it's the quiet ones that get you. The ones that unfold slowly, over days or weeks. The ones where no one screams, but everything suffers. I've never forgotten her. I never will. Not because it was the most gruesome case I've seen, but because it reminded me how fragile life can be, and how close we all live to things that eat and rot and decay, just waiting for an open door. Sometimes I still feel them, phantom sensations under my gloves, a squirming in my wrist that isn't there. I check my sleeves. Nothing. Just memory. But I also remember her tail wagging on that last day, her nose nudging into my hand, her weight leaning gently against my knee. And that makes it easier to keep going, even when the smell comes back, even when the nightmares do. Because I know that sometimes, if you catch it in time, you can pull something back from the edge. And sometimes that's enough. When I was 2 years old, I don't remember anything. Not really. Maybe some flashes, colors, voices, the shape of the furniture in the old apartment, but nothing clear. Most of what I know about those early years came from what my mom told me when I was older. And she didn't always tell the same story every time. Sometimes she'd talk about how she was exhausted, how I cried all night, how she missed having time to herself. But there was this other story, the one she brought up only when she was tired or half drunk, or when something bad happened around the house, and she felt need to make sense of it. That's when she'd talk about the Ouija board. And Henry, she bought it from a garage sale. She said, a lady was selling off a bunch of her dead mother's stuff and didn't seem to care what went where. The board looked old and stained, with a wooden planchette and no instructions. Just the usual yes and no, and the alphabet printed in faded black letters across the surface. My mom wasn't a spiritual person. She didn't believe in ghosts, never went to church. But she said she felt drawn to it, like it was calling out to her. The way she explained it later, it felt like a harmless novelty at first. Something she played with while I napped or cried in the next room. But the more she used it, the more specific the answers became. Too specific, she said. She told me she kept getting the same spirit over and over. A boy named Henry, 8 years old. He said he died in a fire or a fall, or sometimes he wouldn't say anything about how. My mom thought it was creepy, but fascinating. She'd ask it questions, and the planchette would slide smoothly, even if her hands barely touched it. One time, she said she asked who he was looking for, and the answer was mother. That's when she started to feel like she wasn't just playing around anymore. Then the messages changed, got darker. The boy would say things like he stole my life, and you were mine first, and you're not supposed to love him. Meaning me. She said she stopped using the board after a few months, put it in the closet, and tried to forget about it. But she never threw it away. That part always stuck with me. Even though she said it terrified her, she kept it. I think she felt guilty. Or maybe part of her believed it really was someone she'd lost. A year after I was born, she had a miscarriage. I didn't know this until I was much older. It wasn't something she talked about. But eventually, the pieces clicked. I found an old folder of ultrasound photos in a drawer when I was a teenager, all dated before my second birthday. That's how I found out. I asked her once, and she admitted it. She didn't want to talk about it, but she nodded. And I wondered if that child, who would have been just older than me, was the real Henry. If he ever existed at all. Growing up, things weren't right. I don't mean my family. We were just poor. No dad around. My mom worked 2 jobs most of the time. We moved a lot. 1-bedroom apartments, moldy basements, rentals that smelled like smoke and grease. I slept in strange rooms, behind doors that didn't lock. But that's not what I mean. What I mean is, I always felt like I wasn't alone. Not in a normal childhood way. Not like being afraid of the dark. It was something deeper, colder. The earliest memories I do have are filled with fear I couldn't explain. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to sounds I couldn't place. Scraping, like fingernails on drywall. A low tap 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 against the baseboard heater. Footsteps too light for my mother's weight, pacing outside my door. I'd lie still, too scared to breathe, too scared to cry. Sometimes I'd hear whispering, but only just enough to know it was there, never enough to make out the words. By the time I was 5 or 6, I had gotten used to it. Not because I understood it, but because it happened so often it became background noise. I never told anyone. Not my mom, not my friends. I just lived with it. The scariest part wasn't what I heard, but how normal it started to feel. Then there was the black man. I didn't know what I was describing back then, just that I saw something. A tall figure, always in the same spot, at the edge of the hallway or behind the living room curtain. I never saw him move, just standing there, arms at his sides, as if he were waiting. I'd tell my parents about him when I was little. I didn't think it was scary. I thought he was part of the house. But they got real quiet when I described him. My mom told me later that I described, in detail, the man who used to live there, the landlord's husband. He died years before, trying to fix something in the crawl space. Even that didn't feel like the worst part. The worst part was the feeling that I didn't belong in my own life. I don't know how else to explain it. I would sit in my room, playing with toys, and suddenly feel this overwhelming sense that I wasn't supposed to be there. Like I was trespassing in someone else's story. Sometimes I'd look in the mirror and not recognize myself. Other times I'd walk into a room and feel this wave of nausea, like the air was rejecting me. I kept thinking over and over that I took something that wasn't mine, that I didn't earn my place. When I turned 16, my mom went to a psychic. She'd never done anything like that before. She didn't even tell me about it until much later. She said she went because things had started happening again. Scratches on the wall behind my bed, kitchen drawers opening by themselves, cold spots in the hallway. She didn't think it was ghosts. She thought it was stress. But then the psychic told her she was supposed to have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. She had me. She had the miscarriage. The 3rd one never came. The psychic told her there was a spirit attached to me, a vengeful one, a child, someone who believed I took his place. I didn't hear this until months after she went. She didn't want to scare me. But by then, I was already scared. I'd been scared for years. By the time I was 18, things got worse. I was living in a basement apartment while trying to work part-time and go to community college. It was the cheapest place I could find, and it felt like hell. Cold all the time. No windows. The furnace groaned like an animal. I'd lie awake for hours, listening to the pipes knock like someone was trying to get in. My dreams got violent. I'd wake up with nosebleeds. I'd find long scratches on my arms and legs, ones I couldn't explain. I thought maybe I was doing it in my sleep. I tried sleeping with socks on my hands, even taped them shut once. Still woke up with marks. It all came to a point the night I moved out. I decided to leave without really knowing why. Just this instinct, like if I stayed another night, something bad was going to happen. I didn't pack everything, just the essentials. A duffel bag, my laptop, a box of clothes. I left in the middle of the night and went to stay with my cousin. The next morning, my landlord called me. Said the furnace had exploded. The whole basement was scorched. The fire had started near the old wall paneling, right behind where my bed had been. No injuries, but the apartment was a loss. That was the final straw for me. I stopped pretending it was nothing. I started reading about attachment trauma, sleep paralysis, residual hallucinations caused by early childhood stress. I didn't want to believe in ghosts. I still don't. But I needed something, anything, to explain what was happening to me. And I started thinking more about Henry. Or rather, the idea of Henry. Maybe there never was a spirit. Maybe my mom projected all her guilt about the miscarriage onto that board. Maybe she believed, in some twisted way, that I'd stolen something from her. That I was the wrong child. That thought stuck in my mind more than any ghost story ever could. And maybe I believed it too. I started therapy at 20. It took me months to even talk about the things I'd experienced. Not because I thought I was crazy, but because part of me was still afraid they were real. My therapist didn't dismiss me. She helped me unpack the early trauma, the unstable home life, the way my mom had emotionally distanced herself when I was young, the way she projected her grief onto me through symbols and stories I wasn't equipped to understand. It didn't fix everything. I still hear things sometimes, still feel watched when I'm alone, but I've learned to live with it. I remind myself that brains can create entire realities when they're under stress, that I was raised in chaos, that I wasn't possessed or cursed or haunted. I was neglected, and neglect leaves echoes. I haven't spoken to my mom much in the last few years. Not out of anger, just distance. I think she did her best, but her best wasn't enough. She carries her ghosts. I carry mine, and I've learned that you don't need spirits to be haunted. Guilt is enough. Loss is enough. Misunderstood grief, passed from mother to child like a disease, that's enough. And Henry? If he ever existed, he exists in that space. Not on the walls, not in the shadows, but in the silence between what should have been and what was. In my mother's quiet sobs when she thought I was asleep. In the hollow feeling I've carried since I could first understand that I wasn't wanted in the way a child should be. Now I live in a small apartment with windows and light and furniture I chose myself. I lock the doors. I sleep through most nights. I still wake up sometimes, heart pounding, staring into corners I don't want to look at too closely. But I breathe through it. I remind myself where I am. I remind myself who I am. I'm not a replacement. I'm not a thief. I'm just someone who lived through a story that was never mine to begin with. And I survived it. It was my third day in the maternity ward, and I still wasn't used to the smell. People think hospitals always smell clean, like rubbing alcohol or lemon floor cleaner. But this place didn't smell like that. It smelled like damp fabric, sweat, metal, dry blood. The kind of smell that clings to your nostrils and settles there. It was hot, too. The overhead fans worked slowly, rotating with a dull clicking noise, not doing much to push the heavy air around. The building was old. You could see it in the chipped paint on the walls, the stained ceiling tiles, the rust on the rolling beds. Nothing really worked right here, but they kept using it because there was nowhere else. The beds were lined up in a long row, just separated by thin blue curtains. Privacy wasn't really a thing in this place. You could hear everything. Women groaning, nurses shuffling by, machines beeping their strange little rhythms. Even when you pulled the curtain shut, it was like trying to block out a storm with a bedsheet. It didn't matter. That day, I was assigned to observation. No deliveries, no emergencies, just keep an eye on the patients, help clean up, assist the nurses if they asked. It was supposed to be an easy shift, but sometimes the easy shifts are the ones that get under your skin. She was lying at the end of the row. A woman in her late 20s, maybe early 30s. Her hair was wet with sweat, stuck to the sides of her face. She was on her back, staring up at the ceiling with her mouth open slightly. I noticed her because of how still she was. Her arms were limp at her sides, legs spread and heavy, blood pooling beneath her on the rubber mattress. It had soaked through the thin sheet and made dark stains around the edges. The birth had already happened. There was no crying baby, no family standing beside her. Just her, staring blankly, with dried blood on her thighs and the wall behind her curtain dotted with tiny red splashes. I didn't need to ask. You could tell. Stillbirth. They didn't move her right away. They never did. There was this strange pause after those births. Like everyone, even the staff, didn't know what to do. Some nurses said it was policy to let the mother have time to process it. Others said it was just because there wasn't enough help to move her quickly. I think both were true. There was another girl, 6 beds down from her, young. So young, I thought she might have been here for someone else at first. But no, she was the patient. 16, they said. Pregnant with her first. I don't think I'd ever seen someone so small and look so empty at the same time. She wasn't crying, wasn't moving, wasn't shifting in pain. She just lay there, the hospital gown bunched at her belly, and stared at that woman with the stillborn. She hadn't blinked in minutes. Her eyes were fixed, completely unblinking, like she wasn't looking at a person but something far away that she couldn't explain. You hear about people who check out before something terrible happens. That's what she looked like. She looked like someone who had already disappeared, whose body was still here, but everything else had sunk into some cold, dark corner. I walked past her once, slowly, carrying a tray of soiled linens. She didn't flinch. I followed her line of sight and saw what she was looking at. The dead baby wasn't there anymore. The nurse had wrapped it and taken it away, but the mother hadn't moved. Not an inch. Her eyes were dry. I don't think she cried either. Just stared and stared and stared. The mattress below her squished slightly when I walked by. The blood wasn't drying fast in the heat. It had soaked her gown, soaked her skin, and stuck her to the bed like glue. I don't think she cared. The air was thick around her, like her grief made the room heavier. The young girl must have felt it too. She still hadn't looked away. That night, I couldn't sleep. Even back at the dorm, I kept seeing those eyes. The girl's eyes. The kind of dead, glassy eyes you usually only see on bodies in the morgue. But she was alive. She was alive and still breathing, and yet looked more gone than the woman who'd just lost her child. The next morning was slow. The place was quiet, which was strange for that hour. Usually, the morning rounds were loud. Crying, nurses calling, babies being fed. But not that day. It was thick with some kind of strange silence. The kind that makes your skin feel itchy. I walked back into the ward and was handed a chart and told to check the newborns. Just routine. Most were fine. Some were with their mothers, suckling quietly. Others were being rocked by nurses, wrapped tight in blue or pink blankets. They always looked so small in the crook of an arm. I got to the back corner, the bed closest to the wall. The light was dimmer here. The curtain had been half drawn. The baby was lying in a clear plastic bassinet. Alone. No mother nearby. I assumed it had been born earlier that morning. The tag on its ankle read, "Baby of Maria G. Female. Full term. 6 pounds 4 ounces. No mention of complications." But something felt wrong. Her chest wasn't moving. I looked closer. No rise, no fall. No twitch of the nose, no movement of the fingers. Her skin wasn't pale yet, but it looked too still, like porcelain. Her mouth was slightly open. That's when I saw it. A brown shape. Small at first, like the edge of a penis shell. Then it moved. My stomach turned. A cockroach. Long, oily black. Legs twitching. Antennae brushing against the inside of the baby's lips. It pushed out slowly, crawling up from the back of her throat. I froze. I couldn't breathe. It climbed out like it had been sleeping inside her, like the baby was just a shell it had used to stay warm. And then I realized why the baby wasn't breathing. It was lodged deep inside her throat. She'd choked. I couldn't scream. I couldn't call for help. I just turned and vomited into a waste bin beside the bed. It felt like my whole body was trying to shake the image loose. But it didn't work. It stayed, even when I shut my eyes. Especially then. A nurse finally came running, followed by 2 more. They checked the baby, then started yelling. Someone took my arm and pulled me back, sat me down, told me to breathe. I couldn't. Not right. They wrapped the baby in a sheet and took her away. A janitor came to clean the floor beside the bassinet where my vomit had pooled. The smell of bleach and balm made me dizzy. I just sat there, numb. They figured it out later, best they could. The night before, the generator had failed. Air conditioning had gone down. One of the storerooms had gotten too warm, too damp. Roaches had gotten into the storage bins where extra bedding was kept. One must have crawled into the folds of a baby's blanket during the rush of early morning feedings. No one noticed. No one thought to look. She must have swallowed it in her sleep. It made me feel sick all over again. Later that day, I saw her again, the 16-year-old girl. They moved her to the delivery area. She hadn't made a sound, but her water had broken. Her belly was hard and high, her face still blank. She just lay there, staring straight up, the same look as yesterday. Eyes fixed, hollow. The labor lasted hours. I watched from the other side of the curtain, told not to help, just observe. I heard the nurse whisper that the girl hadn't said a single word since being admitted. Not one. No crying. No screaming. Not even when the baby started crowning. She just clenched her jaw and pushed. When it was over, they placed the baby, alive, crying, on her chest. She didn't touch it. Didn't blink. Her eyes never left the ceiling. The nurse tried to coax her. Tried to get her to hold the baby. Still nothing. I watched her fingers. They twitched once, then went still again. The baby cried, and she lay there like a statue. Eventually, they took the baby to the nursery. I walked past her room again before my shift ended. She was lying there alone, her gown soaked in sweat. Her thighs were streaked with blood. Her hands lay flat at her sides, palms up. She looked like that other woman, the one from the day before, the one whose baby had died. It was like they had the same weight inside them. Not grief. Not fear, just this thick, dead silence that nothing could move. That night, I went home and lay on my back on a mattress in the dorm room, the fan spinning above me, slow and useless. I kept thinking about that cockroach, the way it climbed out of the baby's mouth like it belonged there, like it had made a home inside her. I thought about how long it must have taken her to die, how her body was too small to fight it, how no one was there to see her choking, how quiet it must have been. I thought about that girl, 16, alone, empty-eyed, and how her baby had lived, but she hadn't come back from wherever she went inside herself. Maybe she was still gone. Maybe she wasn't ever going to return. And I thought about how sometimes the worst things don't look like monsters. They look like a nursery bassinet with a folded blanket. They look like a young girl staring at the ceiling. They look like a cockroach crawling out of a baby's mouth in the morning light. That was the last week I worked in maternity. I asked for reassignment to general ward. They moved me. I never went back. No one ever asked me what I saw. I never told them. There wasn't a way to make the words feel real enough. It just became something I carry, something that waits behind my eyelids when I try to sleep. I still see the girl sometimes. Still see the baby. Still feel the heat of that room. People think horror is something loud, screaming, running. I was 13 that summer, maybe 14. I can't remember the exact date, just that I was in 8th grade, and it was toward the tail end of the school year. I made it through final exams and end-of-year projects, and my family had planned a trip out of the country to visit some old family friends. It wasn't a place I was familiar with. They lived somewhere in Central America, though the exact location didn't mean much to me back then. It was just hot, everything was always a little damp, and it smelled like earth and wet leaves no matter where you were. We were staying with the friends in their home. It wasn't a big place, but it was warm and clean. It sat on a slight incline, and the windows stayed open during the day to let in any possible breeze, though mostly the air just hung heavy and still. They had tile floors and wooden shutters instead of glass, and there were ceiling fans in every room that spun slowly, trying their best to fight the heat. I remember the fans made a soft whirring noise that faded into the background after a while. You didn't even hear it unless you stopped to listen. We'd been there for almost 2 weeks, and I was tired in a way I couldn't really explain. Maybe it was the travel, or the constant socializing, or the fact that everything smelled and looked different from home. Maybe I just wasn't sleeping well. The beds were hard, and I'd wake up sweating even though I fell asleep shivering. I remember always being just a little uncomfortable. It wasn't anything huge, just a low-grade sort of unease that never really went away. That afternoon, I felt the exhaustion come down on me all at once. We just had lunch, something with beans and rice, I think, and my stomach felt full in a heavy, sleepy way. The adults were talking and laughing in the main room, their voices echoing slightly off the tiled floor and plaster walls. I stood up and quietly walked off, slipping into the guest room without saying anything. It wasn't a large room, barely enough space for the bed, a small nightstand, and an old wooden dresser that had a mirror nailed to the back of it. There was a fan hanging from the ceiling, and it spun on the lowest setting, its blades making that rhythmic sound as it moved through the humid air. The shutters were partially closed, so the light was dim and the corners of the room looked like they were in a permanent shadow. I lay down on the bed. The sheets were thin and a little stiff, probably washed and dried in the sun. They smelled faintly of soap and something else I couldn't place, maybe mildew or the lingering scent of the outdoors. I turned on my side and closed my eyes. I wasn't fully asleep, but I was hovering in that hazy space where your thoughts start to drift and your body begins to let go. That's when I felt it. A light tickle just by the edge of my right ear. It was so soft that for a moment I thought it was just a strand of my hair, moved by the breeze of the fan. I had longer hair then, long enough that it often brushed against my cheeks or tickled my neck when I moved. The fan above was spinning lazily, and I didn't think much of it. I shifted slightly, let my head rest more fully into the pillow, and try to sink back into that fading sleep. Seconds later, everything changed. I don't know how to describe the sensation exactly. It wasn't just a tickle this time. It was a sudden, invasive, frantic movement right at the edge of my ear canal. I remember my body going rigid, my breath catching in my throat, and then pure panic exploded through me as I realized something was crawling into my ear. I was up in an instant, clawing at the side of my head, trying to dig it out, trying to stop it, trying to do something, anything, but it was already too far in. I could feel its legs, or maybe its antennae, scraping the skin inside my ear as it moved deeper. I screamed, or I think I did. I remember the raw panic in my chest more than the sound itself. I ran from the room, stumbling a little, still holding the side of my head like I could somehow trap it there, stop it from going further. My hearing was already different in that ear, muffled, wrong, as if someone had pressed a shell to the side of my head. But worse than the muffled sound was the new noise I couldn't ignore. The bug was making noises. It wasn't loud, but was right there inside my head. A kind of high-pitched clicking or chirping. Not constant, just short little bursts of sound like it was reacting to being trapped or moving or maybe trying to figure out where to go next. I didn't even know bugs made noises like that. Not up close, not inside you. I could feel it moving and hear it too, both at the same time, and the combination was almost too much to take. The rest of the next few minutes is blurry. My mom brought me into the bathroom and tried to help me stay calm. I remember being told to tilt my head to the side, ear facing down, then up toward the light above the mirror. The idea was that maybe the bug would crawl back out, drawn toward the light. But it didn't. I stood like that for what felt like forever. Every second that passed felt like a minute. I could hear the little legs scraping against the sensitive skin inside my ear, the occasional soft chirp that made my stomach twist. I was frozen, terrified that any sudden move might make it go deeper. Eventually, my mom decided we had to try something else. She grabbed a clean cup from the counter and filled it with water. I knew what she was going to do before she said anything. The plan was to flood it out. I didn't know if that would work or not. I wasn't even sure if the bug could drown. I stood still as she poured the water in slowly, tilting my head sideways again. The cold rush of water filled my ear and the pressure was instant. It didn't hurt, but it was overwhelming in a different way. The noise of the water made it hard to tell if the bug was still moving, still clicking. Then, just as I was about to panic again, I heard a sound I'll never forget. It was this strange little squeak, like the bug had been surprised. That's the only way I can describe it. A startled, wet squeak that came just before the water seemed to reach the farthest part of the canal. Then a second later, there was a soft gurgle, almost like a drowning gasp. It sounded like a series of tiny blub, blub, blub noises, faint but unmistakable. Then it stopped. No more chirping, no more scraping, no more movement. I stood there, trying to decide if I felt relief or something worse. I told my mom it was quiet now. She waited a few more seconds, then let me tilt my head over the sink to drain the water. Nothing came out. Not the bug, not even a wing or leg. Just a stream of water and then silence. She dried the outside of my ear with a towel and told me to sit down. I did, but the panic hadn't fully left my body. I kept waiting to feel something again. A twitch, a sound, anything, but it stayed quiet. Later that evening, I sat alone in the guest room, afraid to lay back down. I kept one ear uncovered just in case. I didn't sleep well that night or the next one. In fact, I didn't sleep properly for the rest of the trip. Even after we came home, I was still checking my ear constantly, afraid it was still in there. Afraid it had laid eggs or that it would start moving again. Eventually, my mom took me to the doctor. They looked inside with one of those little scopes and told us they didn't see anything. No bug, no parts, nothing. They said it must have fallen out without me realizing, or maybe it had broken down somehow. But I never saw it. Not a piece of it. Not a trace. Even now, all these years later, that moment hasn't left me. Whenever I feel the smallest itch near my ear, just a strand of hair or a bit of sweat, I freeze. I have to check. I run my finger around the edge. I tilt my head and listen. I know it's probably nothing, but I have to be sure. I never found out what kind of bug it was. Crickets make chirping sounds, but they're too big to crawl into an ear, I think. Maybe it was some kind of beetle, or something local to that part of the world. All I know is that it was alive, it was inside me, and for a while it made itself at home in the one place I couldn't reach. That kind of thing changes you. You don't go back to normal after that. Not really. You just learn to live with it. You learn to sleep with one ear exposed, to listen for noises that aren't there, to doubt your own body when it tells you everything is fine. Because sometimes it isn't, and sometimes you never get to see what it was that scared you the most. I was about 6, maybe 7, when we moved into that house. I remember it clearly because everything about that place felt old. Not just the chipped paint or creaking floors. Everything smelled like it had been sealed up in a box for 50 years. The air was musty, dry in some places, damp in others. You'd walk from one room to the next and feel the temperature shift like you were stepping into a different house altogether. The house was a 2-story colonial-style home with a wide porch and tall, narrow windows. It sat on a quiet street that looked like it hadn't changed since the 60s. My parents said it was a fixer-upper, but I don't remember anyone ever fixing anything while we were there. The day we moved in, I remember being in the living room with my younger brother. We were unpacking a box of toys, mostly Hot Wheels and old plastic Army men. The living room had hardwood floors that dipped slightly in the middle, like a bowl. We sat on the rug, lining up the cars and pretending we were building a racetrack. That was the first time we saw her. She stood just to the left of the doorway, near the base of the stairs. I noticed her first. My brother was focused on pushing a red car across the rug, but something made me look up. She wasn't moving. She just stood there, her hands folded over each other. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress that went down to her ankles, with a tight frilly collar and a brooch at her throat. Her white hair was pulled back into a bun, and her face was tight, almost severe. I remember the way her lips pressed into a line, her eyes narrow, focused right on us. Then she wagged her finger at us. 1, 2, 3 short motions, like a silent reprimand. No sound, no movement except for that finger. I looked at my brother, who had frozen. I knew he saw her too. When we turned back, she was gone. No sound, no footsteps, just gone. That wasn't the last time we saw her. It became a pattern, usually when we were playing on the floor. Cars, action figures, Lego, it didn't matter. We'd be mid-game, mid-thought, and she'd appear. Same spot, same expression, same slow wagging of her finger. And every time, we'd stop. We wouldn't say anything to each other, just freeze. She never spoke, never moved beyond that one gesture. Then she'd disappear, and we'd sit in silence, not knowing what to do next. We told our parents once, but they brushed it off. Old houses have weird creaks, or maybe it's the shadows. But it wasn't shadows. She was as real as the furniture. At night, things got worse. The upstairs hallway ran from my bedroom to my parents' room, with a bathroom in between and my brother's room at the far end. The floorboards were loud, brittle under pressure. You couldn't walk 5 steps without announcing your presence. That's why I knew it wasn't us making the noises. Every night, around the same time, just after midnight, I'd hear it. The slow, steady sound of someone walking the hallway. I'd lay there, perfectly still, with my blanket up to my nose, listening to each step. They weren't rushed. They weren't trying to be quiet either. Just walking, sometimes from one end to the other, sometimes back and forth. Sometimes they'd stop right in front of my door, and I'd hear nothing for a minute or two, just silence and wait, like someone was standing there. Once, I worked up the courage to open my door right after the footsteps stopped. I swung it open fast, thinking maybe I'd catch someone, but the hallway was empty. Cold. I remember the cold the most. It wasn't just cool air. It was a still, biting cold that felt like it was coming from inside the walls. The kitchen was the worst. During the day, the kitchen looked like any other kitchen. Dated tile, old fridge, yellowed curtains. But something about it made my stomach twist. It had these moments, usually in the late afternoon, when the light would come in from the back window just right, and you could see your breath even though it was 75 degrees outside. My mom always had the oven running or something cooking, so it didn't make sense for it to be cold in there. But I'd walk in, and the air would hit me like a wet cloth. I never wanted to be in there alone. I'd grab whatever I needed and run out. There were other things too. Voices mostly. Whispers. Always my name. They'd come from strange places. Behind a couch. From inside a closet. Once from the bathtub, when no one else was upstairs. It was never loud, never aggressive. Just soft, like someone trying to get your attention without waking up the whole room. The worst moment came one night around 2 in the morning. I was half asleep, facing the window. My room looked out over the driveway, and there was a street lamp outside that kept the window dimly lit through the night. I was in that space between sleep and waking, when your body's still, but your mind's kind of drifting. And then a hand covered the entire window. Not a person, not a body, just a hand. Spread fingers, shadowed but solid. It looked like someone was standing directly outside the glass, palm pressed against it, fingers reaching up into the corners. The size of it was wrong. Too big. Way too big to be real. But it didn't move. Didn't tap or slide. Just stayed there, fingers twitching slightly, enough to let me know it wasn't just a shadow. I shut my eyes and didn't open them until morning. But the part that stuck with me most, the part that seeped into my bones and stayed with me even after we left, was the dreams. My mom had this doll. It sat on a shelf in the den, high up where we weren't supposed to touch it. It was one of those Raggedy Andy type dolls with red yarn hair and a painted-on smile. It wore patch clothes and had round button eyes. I remember she said it belonged to her when she was a kid, that it had sentimental value. I didn't like it. Even before the dream started, I didn't like the way it looked. I didn't like the way it faced the room like it was watching. I didn't like how its legs dangled over the edge of the shelf. I didn't like that no one else seemed to notice how creepy it was. The dream started about a month into living in that house. At first, it was just flashes. I'd be walking through the house and see it out of the corner of my eye, standing in the hallway, sitting at the kitchen table, laying on my bed. Then it became more vivid. I'd dream I was playing in the yard, and it would be at the edge of the trees, staring at me. Or I'd be in the bath, and it would walk through the doorway, silent and slow. Then came the dragging. I had one dream, so real I still feel it sometimes, where I woke up in bed but couldn't move. I saw the doll standing near my dresser. It didn't walk. It didn't float. It just appeared. Then it was closer. Then at the foot of the bed. Then beside me. Then it grabbed my leg and pulled. The bed tilted, and I slid out like a rag doll. My fingernails scratched against the floor, my arms flailing, but it pulled and pulled, dragging me into the hallway, down the stairs, out the front door. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. That wasn't the last dream. They kept coming. Every few nights. Different scenarios, same doll. Sometimes it would talk, though I could never understand the words. Sometimes it would just watch from a distance. Sometimes it would be in places it didn't belong. At school, in the backseat of the car, or my grandparents' house. Even after we moved, only 3 months after arriving, the dreams didn't stop. The day we left, I remember feeling like I could breathe again. My parents didn't say much about why we were leaving so suddenly. Just that the house needed too many repairs, or the area wasn't right. But I knew they felt something too. My mom had started avoiding the kitchen. My dad looked more tired than I'd ever seen him. The woman in the hallway, the footsteps, the voices, the hand, the cold, the doll, all of it just followed me. We moved into a newer house in a different part of town. It was clean, bright, warm, but the dreams kept coming. Years passed, and they still showed up. Not as often, maybe once a month, then once every few months, but always the same feeling, the same cold dread, the same face. I'm 34 now. I live a normal life. Got a decent job, a small apartment. I haven't had the dream in a while, maybe a couple of years, but that doll is still in my parents' house. They moved it to a different room after redecorating, but it's still there. Still sitting on a shelf, legs dangling, button eyes staring. And I still can't sit in the same room with it. Every visit I avoid it. I don't make a big deal out of it. I just keep my distance. My parents never really noticed. Or maybe they did, and they didn't want to talk about it. Either way, I keep the visits short. There's nothing supernatural about any of it. I don't believe in ghosts or demons or haunted houses. I've thought about it a lot over the years. More than I should, probably. The house was old. The woman we saw could have been a memory. Some visual echo burned into our minds from photographs, old portraits left behind. The footsteps? Old plumbing. Creaking floors. The hand on the window. Maybe a dream. A waking hallucination brought on by stress or anxiety. But the dreams about the doll? Those came from me. From something in my head. Some unresolved fear or stress response to everything else that happened in those months. My brain gave shape to the anxiety. It gave it a face. It gave it that doll. And over time, that face became something I couldn't look at without remembering how I felt back then. Powerless, watched, vulnerable. We were only in that house for 3 months, but it shaped the next 8 years of my life. It shaped how I slept, how I walked into rooms, how I listened to silence. Even now, decades later, I still find myself